Picture, if you will, the most peaceful place on Earth. It is 3 o'clock in the morning, somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from any shore you might recognize. The water stretches endlessly in every direction, a liquid mirror reflecting the stars above. There is no sound here except the gentle whisper of waves against themselves, a rhythm as old as time itself, steady and hypnotic. The ocean breathes slowly beneath a canopy of stars so brilliant they seem close enough to touch. In this vast emptiness, where the curve of the earth becomes apparent and the horizon dissolves into mystery, something remarkable once happened. For over 1,000 years, people crossed these waters not with engines or GPS, not with metal ships or satellite guidance, but with wooden canoes and an understanding of the sky so profound it seems almost magical to us today. Tonight, as we drift together on these imaginary waters, we're going to discover how ancient Polynesian navigators read the language of clouds to find islands they had never seen before. It's a story that unfolds as slowly and peacefully as the waves themselves. It's perfect for letting your mind wander and your body relax. The Pacific Ocean covers 1/3 of our planet's surface. It's so vast that if you placed every continent inside it, there would still be room for another Africa, yet across this seemingly impossible distance. Polynesian navigators traveled from island to island with the confidence of someone walking through their own neighborhood. They carried with them no maps, no compass, no instruments of any kind we would recognize. Instead, they carried something far more subtle and powerful: the ability to read the sky like an open book. Imagine floating here in the darkness, feeling the gentle rise and fall of swells that have traveled thousands of miles without obstruction. These waves carry stories from distant shores, patterns that speak to those who know how to listen. Above, the stars wheel slowly overhead, the same constellations that guided voyagers for generations. And there, barely visible in the starlight, wisps of cloud drift across the sky, carrying their own secrets for those patient enough to decode them. The water beneath us is deep, deeper than the highest mountains are tall. In some places, the ocean floor lies 7 miles below the surface, creating an underwater landscape more dramatic and varied than anything on land. Yet the Polynesian navigators learned to read even these hidden depths, understanding how islands far below could influence the behavior of waves, the patterns of clouds, and the very color of the sea itself. As we begin this journey together, let the rhythm of these gentle waves carry away the tensions of your day. Feel yourself settling into the peaceful darkness of the Pacific night, where time moves slowly and ancient wisdom waits to unfold like clouds across the star-filled sky. Here, in this place of infinite calm, we'll discover how human beings developed one of the most remarkable navigation systems ever conceived, apt reading the natural world with a sensitivity that seems almost supernatural to our modern eyes. The stars above us have watched over countless voyages, countless moments of discovery, as skilled navigators guided their people across the vast ocean toward new homes, new possibilities, new chapters in the great story of human exploration. Tonight, we become part of that story, drifting peacefully through the same waters where ancient wisdom once flourished, where the language of clouds was spoken as fluently as any human tongue. Imagine awakening on a small island in the middle of an endless ocean. The morning sun paints the water in shades of turquoise and gold, and palm trees sway gently in the trade winds that have blown steadily across these waters for millions of years. This is the world the Polynesians called home, not one place, but thousands of islands scattered across the Pacific like jewels on blue velvet, each one a stepping stone in an archipelago of dreams. From Hawaii in the north to New Zealand in the south, from Easter Island in the east to Fiji in the west, these islands form what we now call the Polynesian Triangle. It's an area larger than North America and Europe combined, yet the total landmass of all these islands together would fit comfortably within the borders of New Zealand alone. Most of the Polynesian world is water, vast, deep, blue water that connected rather than separated these far-flung communities. To understand how remarkable their navigation was, we must first understand how the Polynesians viewed the ocean. While many cultures saw the sea as a barrier, something dangerous to be crossed only when absolutely necessary, Polynesians saw it as a highway, a familiar road that led to relatives, trading partners, and new opportunities. The ocean was not empty space between destinations. It was their neighborhood, their workplace, their spiritual home where ancestors dwelt and where the future beckoned. The Polynesian islands themselves tell a story of incredible diversity within a shared culture. There were volcanic islands that rose dramatically from the seafloor, their peaks shrouded in clouds that would later play such an important role in navigation. These high islands, formed by underwater volcanoes, created their own weather systems, drawing moisture from the trade winds and wrapping themselves in distinctive cloud formations that could be seen from incredible distances. Then there were the coral atolls, barely rising above sea level, forming perfect circles or crescents around turquoise lagoons, so clear you could see the sandy bottom 30 feet below. These low islands presented their own unique challenges and opportunities for navigation. While they might be invisible until you were almost upon them, they created subtle but distinctive patterns in the clouds above, changes so delicate that only the most skilled observers could detect them. Each island had its own character, its own gifts to offer the greater Polynesian community. Some were blessed with volcanic soil so rich that sweet potatoes and taro would grow in abundance. Others offered precious resources like obsidian for tools or specific types of wood perfect for canoe construction. Many provided safe harbors, where voyaging fleets could rest and resupply during long journeys between distant island groups. The high volcanic islands created what navigators learned to recognize as standing clouds, formations that remained relatively stationary because they were created by the island itself. As trade winds encountered the mountains, they were forced upward, cooling as they rose and condensing into clouds that often topped the peaks like whitecaps. These cloud caps could be visible from distances of over 100 miles on clear days, serving as beacons for navigators still far over the horizon from the islands themselves. Between these islands lived a people who developed perhaps the most sophisticated understanding of natural navigation the world has ever known. Were not just sailors in the way we might understand the term today. They were oceanographers who understood currents and swells, meteorologists who could predict weather patterns days in advance, astronomers who knew the stars as intimately as we know the streets of our neighborhoods, and ecologists who understood the intricate relationships between islands, weather, and sea life. The society that developed this remarkable skill was built entirely around the ocean's rhythm and gifts. Families were connected not just to their immediate neighbors on the same island, but to relatives on islands hundreds of miles away. Marriage partners might come from distant atolls, creating kinship networks that spanned thousands of miles of open ocean. Trade routes crossed vast distances, carrying not just goods like tools, food, and ornaments, but news, stories, songs, and the genetic diversity that kept scattered communities healthy and connected as one people. This was a civilization that not only survived but thrived on connection across distance, and the navigators were the golden threads that wove it all together. They were revered figures in their communities, master craftsmen of a skill so complex and vital that their training could take decades to complete. To become a navigator was to become a keeper of secrets, a reader of signs invisible to others, a bridge between the known world and the vast unknowns that lay beyond the horizon. The knowledge they carried was not written in books or carved in stone. Instead, it lived in memory. It's preserved in chants and stories that encoded not just the practical information needed for navigation, but the deeper wisdom of how to read the living world around them. Every cloud formation, every shift in the wind, every change in the behavior of seabirds carried meaning for those trained to perceive it. As we drift here in the peaceful darkness of the Pacific night, we can almost feel the presence of those ancient navigators, their eyes scanning the horizon, their minds processing 1,000 subtle clues that speak of islands beyond the edge of sight. Their world was one of infinite possibility, where the next island, the next home, the next chapter in their people's story lay always just beyond the horizon, waiting to be discovered through the patient reading of clouds and stars and sea. The language of clouds was organized around several key categories of observation, each providing different types of navigational information. There were clouds of shape and form, the actual visible structure of cloud formations and how they differed from the typical patterns of open ocean sky. There were clouds of color and light, subtle variations in hue and brightness that revealed information about the surfaces below. There were clouds of movement and behavior, patterns of change and persistence that spoke of the forces creating and sustaining the formations. Shape was perhaps the most obvious category. Navigators learned to distinguish between the typical cumulus clouds that formed over open ocean and the distinctive formations created by land masses. Island clouds often had flatter tops, created by temperature inversions above the land. They might show characteristic streaming patterns as trade winds flowed around topographic obstacles. Some islands created cloud formations that looked like smoke or steam rising from the sea, while others generated neat cap-like formations that sat directly above the highest peaks. The size and density of cloud formations also provided important information. A small, isolated cumulus cloud might indicate a tiny coral atoll. A massive, towering formation suggested a large, high island with significant topography. Navigators learned to estimate not just the presence of land, but its approximate size. An elevation based on the characteristics of the clouds above it, color provided another crucial layer of information. While ocean clouds typically appeared white against the blue sky, island clouds often showed subtle color variations that revealed the nature of the land beneath them. Clouds above forested islands might show slight green tinges from light reflected upward by vegetation. Those above sandy beaches or coral reefs could display pale yellow or even pinkish hues. Clouds over lagoons might show the distinctive turquoise color reflected from the shallow water below. These color variations were often most visible at sunrise and sunset, when the low angle of the sun enhanced the subtle differences in reflected light. Experienced navigators would time their most careful cloud observations for these periods. When the sky became a canvas painted with information about distant lands, movement, and persistence, patterns provided the third major category of cloud information. Ocean clouds typically moved with the prevailing winds, forming and dissipating in regular patterns. But island clouds behaved differently. They might remain stationary, while other clouds moved past them, constantly regenerating in the same location, due to the island's influence on local air currents. Or they might show characteristic streaming patterns as they formed on one side of an island and dissipated on the other. Some islands created clouds that appeared and disappeared with predictable daily rhythms, forming as the land heated up during the day and dissipating as it cooled at night. Others maintained more persistent formations that could be visible for days at a time. Understanding these temporal patterns was crucial for navigation, as it allowed navigators to distinguish between island clouds and the many temporary formations that might appear similar but had no navigational significance. The navigation value of clouds extended beyond simple island detection. Experienced navigators could often determine the approximate distance to an island based on cloud characteristics. Closer islands produced sharper, more defined cloud formations, while more distant ones created hazier, less distinct patterns. The height of clouds above the horizon could be used to estimate the size and elevation of the islands creating them. Cloud patterns could also reveal information about passages and channels between islands, wind shadows that created calmer sailing, conditions, and even seasonal changes in local weather patterns that might affect the timing of voyages. Some cloud formations indicated the presence of fresh water on islands, crucial information for voyagers planning extended stays. Perhaps most remarkably, the combination of different cloud indicators could provide navigators with surprisingly detailed information about islands they had never seen. The interplay between cloud shape, color, movement patterns, and seasonal variations created what amounted to aerial signatures for different islands, distinctive patterns it experienced. Navigators could recognize and interpret with remarkable precision. This cloud language is not written down in any books or charts. It lived entirely in the memories and experience of master navigators, passed down through generations of careful teaching and patient practice. Young apprentices would spend years learning to see the subtle differences that distinguished significant cloud patterns from meaningless atmospheric variations, developing an almost intuitive understanding of how sky and sea worked together to create the invisible highways that connected distant islands. The mastery of cloud navigation represented the culmination of the navigator's art. The ability to read in the ever-changing sky above the precise information needed to guide a vessel safely across the vast, specific to specific destinations. It was a skill that required not just knowledge, but wisdom. It's not just observation, but understanding. It's not just seeing, but truly perceiving the deep connections that linked Earth and sky and the ancient dance of wind and weather that still continues. Above the endless waters of the Pacific Ocean, in the vast theater of the Pacific sky, where trade winds push endless battalions of clouds across thousands of miles of open water, certain formations stand apart from the ordinary patterns of ocean. Whether like landmarks in an aerial landscape, these are the high clouds, the towering cumulus formations that rise like white mountains above distant islands, visible from distances so great that the islands themselves lie far below the horizon, invisible to any eye except that of the wind itself. To understand the significance of these high clouds in Polynesian navigation, we must first picture the immense scale of the Pacific Ocean and the challenge faced by navigators seeking land in its vastness. Imagine standing on the deck of a voyaging canoe, looking out over waters that stretch unbroken to the horizon in every direction. From sea level, that horizon lies only about 12 miles away. A tiny circle of visibility in an ocean that may require traveling hundreds or even thousands of miles to reach the next island. But clouds, especially the tall cumulus formations, created by substantial land masses, can be seen from much greater distances. A cloud rising to 20,000 feet above an island might be visible from 70 miles away or more, effectively extending the navigator's range of vision far beyond the limitations imposed by the Earth's curvature. These high clouds serve as aerial lighthouses, announcing the presence of land long before any other signs become apparent. The formation of these navigational beacons begins with the fundamental interaction between land and the atmosphere in the tropical Pacific. When the steady trade winds encounter a substantial island, particularly one with significant elevation, they are forced upward along the island's windward slopes. This lifting process, called orographic uplift, causes the air to cool as it rises, and the moisture it carries begins to condense into droplets that form clouds. The size and persistence of these orographic clouds depend directly on the characteristics of the island creating them. A small, low coral atoll might create only minor atmospheric disturbances, generating fleeting wisps of vapor that quickly dissipate. But a large mountainous island like Hawaii's Big Island or Tahiti can create massive, persistent cloud formations that tower miles into the sky and remain visible for days at a time, anchored to the landscape below by the constant process of air being lifted and cooled as it passes over the peaks. These high island clouds have several distinctive characteristics that make them recognizable to trained navigators. First, they tend to remain stationary relative to other cloud formations in the area. While normal ocean clouds drift with the prevailing winds, island clouds are constantly regenerating in the same location, anchored by the topographic features that create them. A navigator might observe other clouds moving steadily across the sky, while one particular formation remains fixed in place, a sure sign of substantial land beneath it. The shape of high island clouds also differs markedly from typical ocean formations. Instead of the rounded, puffy appearance of normal cumulus clouds, island clouds often develop flattened tops, created by temperature inversions that act like invisible ceilings in the atmosphere. These anvil-shaped formations, called lenticular clouds, can stretch for miles downwind of the islands that create them, forming long, streaming banners that point unmistakably toward their source. Some high islands create cloud formations so distinctive that experienced navigators could identify specific islands by their cloud signatures alone. The island of Bora Bora, with its dramatic central peak rising directly from the lagoon, creates a characteristic cloud formation that differs noticeably from the broader, more complex patterns generated by larger islands like Tahiti. These unique signatures served as aerial fingerprints, allowing navigators to confirm not just the presence of land, but the identity of specific destinations. The vessels that carried Polynesian navigators across thousands of miles of open ocean were marvels of engineering, crafted with a deep understanding of both the sea's power and its moods. These were not the single-hulled boats familiar to most maritime traditions, but double-hulled canoes called wa kalua in Hawaiian or vaka in other Polynesian languages. To see one of these magnificent craft for the first time was to witness something that seemed to blur the line between human creation and natural form. So perfectly were they adapted to their ocean environment. Picture two sleek canoe hulls each, carved from a single massive tree trunk running parallel to each other about 10 to 15 feet apart. The hulls themselves were works of art, their lines flowing and graceful, shaped not just for speed, but for the particular demands of long ocean voyaging. Each hull was typically 60 to 80 feet long, narrow and deep, designed to slice through the water with minimal resistance while providing the stability needed to carry people and supplies across vast distances. Between these two hulls, lashed with coconut fiber rope and patterns that had been perfected over centuries of trial and refinement, stretched a platform that served as both deck and living space. This platform, constructed from bamboo and carefully selected wooden planks, was the heart of the voyaging canoe. Unlike rigid constructions that would break under the immense stresses of ocean travel, this platform flexed gently with the waves, allowing the entire vessel to move like a living thing through the water, bending but never breaking, even in the most challenging conditions. The genius of this design becomes apparent when you consider the unique challenges of Pacific Ocean voyaging. A single-hulled vessel, no matter how large or well-built, can be overwhelmed by the massive swells that roll unobstructed across thousands of miles of open ocean. These swells, sometimes reaching heights of 30 feet or more, would crush or capsize most vessels. But a double hull creates stability without sacrificing speed or maneuverability. The two hulls slice through the water with minimal resistance, while the flexible platform between them provides a stable base that can handle even the most challenging sea conditions. Above this platform rose a triangular sail woven from pandanus, leaves a material so perfectly suited to ocean conditions that it could last for years of constant use, while remaining flexible enough to be adjusted for different wind conditions. The sail was not simply designed to catch wind, but to work with it in sophisticated ways. It could be angled and shaped to allow the canoe to sail much closer to the wind than European square-rigged ships of the same period could manage. In the hands of skilled sailors, these canoes could achieve remarkable speeds, sometimes covering over 200 miles in a single day when conditions were favorable. But speed, while impressive, was not the primary concern for the long voyages that connected distant island groups. These canoes were designed to be homes on the water for weeks or even months at a time, carrying not just the navigator and crew, but entire families seeking new homes on distant islands. The platform provided carefully organized space for sleeping, cooking, and storing the supplies necessary for extended travel. With every square foot planned and utilized with the efficiency born of necessity, fresh water, the most precious commodity, on any ocean voyage was carried in gourds and specially prepared bamboo containers, carefully rationed and supplemented by rainwater collected in the sails during the frequent tropical storms. The voyagers developed ingenious methods for preserving and stretching their water supplies, including techniques for collecting dew and for finding the subtle signs that indicated freshwater sources on distant islands. Food for the journey was equally carefully planned and prepared. Dried fish could last for months without spoiling in the salt air. Fermented breadfruit paste, prepared in ways that preserved its nutritional value while making it portable, provided carbohydrates for sustained energy. Coconuts offered both food and drink and could be kept fresh for weeks with proper storage. Sweet potatoes, carefully selected and cured, provided essential nutrients and variety in the shipboard diet. But perhaps most remarkably, these voyaging canoes often carried the seeds of new communities with them, not just food plants like taro, breadfruit, and bananas, but breeding pairs of the animals that would be essential to establishing new settlements. pigs, dogs, and chickens, along with all the tools, materials, and cultural items needed to recreate Polynesian civilization. On previously uninhabited islands, the construction of such a vessel was itself a community undertaking that could take months or even years to complete. The selection of trees for the hulls was guided by traditional knowledge that took into account not just the size and species of the tree, but its age, the season it was cut, the lunar cycle, and even the specific location where it grew. Wood needed to be not just strong, but properly seasoned and prepared according to methods passed down through generations. The lashing techniques that held everything together were arts unto themselves, with different patterns for different stresses and different parts of the vessel. Master craftsmen knew dozens of different knots and weaving patterns, each designed for specific purposes. The rope itself was made from coconut fiber. It's prepared through a lengthy process of soaking, beating, and twisting that created cordage stronger and more durable than anything available to European sailors of the same period. Most remarkably, these canoes were built entirely without metal fastenings of any kind. Every joint was lashed. Every connection was bound with rope made from natural fibers. This gave the vessels a flexibility that allowed them to bend and twist with the waves rather than breaking under stress. A well-built voyaging canoe could literally flex back into shape after surviving storms that would destroy more rigid vessels. Living aboard such a craft required its own set of skills and adaptations that were passed down from experienced voyagers to newcomers. Space was limited and precious, with every item having its designated place and everything needing to be secured against the constant motion of the sea. The crew learned to sleep in shifts, to move with the rhythm of the waves rather than fighting against it, to find comfort and even joy in conditions that would challenge the most experienced modern sailors at the heart of the vessel. Often in a special shelter constructed on the platform to protect him from sun and spray, sat the navigator with his precious instruments and accumulated knowledge. Unlike European navigators of the same period who relied on charts, compasses, astrolabes, and other metal instruments, the Polynesian navigators' tools were few and subtle. Perhaps a handful of sticks and shells tied together in patterns that represented wave formations and current flows, special gourd for sighting stars and measuring their angles above the horizon. Maybe a few carefully selected stones or pieces of coral arranged in patterns that held meaning only to him and his apprentices. But the navigator's true instruments were his senses and his memory. Honed through decades of training and experience, hour after hour, day after day, he would study the sky and see with an intensity that bordered on meditation. He felt the rhythm of the swells beneath the canoe, noting subtle changes that spoke of distant islands or approaching weather. He watched the behavior of clouds with the focused attention of someone reading a beloved book, seeing in their formations and movements the stories of lands beyond the horizon. The double-hulled canoe was not just his vessel, but his observatory, his laboratory, and his home as he guided his people across the trackless ocean toward islands that existed, for now, only in the language of the clouds and the ancient knowledge carried in his memory and in his heart. In our modern world, we have become accustomed to navigation that relies on instruments, satellites, and screens that tell us exactly where we are and where we need to go. But imagine, if you will, a way of finding your path that requires no technology at all, only the patient observation of the natural world and the wisdom to understand what it is telling you. This was the foundation of Polynesian navigation, the recognition that nature itself is a vast, living map constantly providing information to those who know how to read its subtle language. The Polynesian approach to navigation was fundamentally different from the instrumental methods developed by other maritime cultures. Rather than imposing human-made tools and measurements onto the natural world, Polynesian navigators learned to think like the ocean itself, to see patterns and relationships that connected every element of their environment into one coherent, readable whole. They understood that the sea, the sky, the wind, and all the life within and above the ocean were parts of a single, interconnected system, each element influencing and responding to all the others. The daily rhythm of high cloud formation also provided important navigational information. Many mountainous islands follow predictable patterns of cloud development throughout the day. In the early morning, the peaks might be clear as the land, and air temperatures are relatively equal. But as the sun heats the island during the day, rising air currents strengthen, and clouds begin to form around the mountains. By afternoon, substantial cloud caps might crown the highest peaks, only to dissipate again in the evening as the land cools and the thermal dynamics weaken. Understanding these daily patterns was crucial for navigation timing. A navigator approaching an island in the early morning might see no cloud signature at all, leading him to believe no land was present in that direction. But patience and knowledge of island cloud behavior would tell him to wait and observe. By midday, the characteristic formations might appear, confirming the presence of the island and providing precise directional guidance. The color and texture of high island clouds also carried important information for navigators. Clouds forming over forested mountains often showed subtle green tinges from light reflected upward by the vegetation below. Those over volcanic peaks might appear slightly darker due to minerals and particles in the air. The texture of cloud formations could reveal information about the topography beneath them. Smooth, even clouds suggested gentle terrain, while rough, turbulent formations indicated jagged peaks and steep valleys. Seasonal variations added another layer of complexity and information to the reading of high clouds. During certain times of year, changes in prevailing wind patterns might alter the characteristic cloud formations of familiar islands. Wet seasons might intensify cloud formation, while dry periods could reduce it. These seasonal signatures became part of the navigator's deep knowledge of island behavior, allowing him to account for temporal changes in the aerial landmarks. He relied upon the interaction between high island clouds and other atmospheric phenomena, provided additional navigational clues. Islands large enough to create substantial cloud formations also influenced wind patterns, creating areas of turbulence, wind shadow, and local weather systems that could be detected from considerable distances. The presence of rain squalls associated with island clouds might indicate not just the location of land, but also the availability of fresh water. Crucial information for voyagers planning their approach and landing. Distance estimation. Using high clouds required sophisticated understanding of atmospheric optics and island topography. Navigators learned to judge how far away an island might be based on the clarity and definition of its cloud formations. Sharp, well-defined clouds with clear edges suggested relatively close proximity, while hazy, indistinct formations indicated greater distance. The apparent height of clouds above the horizon could be used to estimate both distance and the elevation of the peaks creating them. Some islands created multiple layers of cloud formations at different altitudes, providing even more detailed navigational information. Lower clouds might form around coastal areas and foothills, while higher formations developed around the peaks. These layered systems could reveal information about the size and topographic complexity of islands, helping navigators prepare for the approach and landing phases of their voyages. The interpretation of high cloud formations required not just visual observation, but an understanding of the meteorological processes creating them. Navigators needed to distinguish between island clouds and other high-altitude formations that might appear similar, but had no navigational significance. Cirrus clouds, formed by high-altitude weather systems, might create confusing patterns that could mislead inexperienced observers. The ability to read the subtle differences between island signatures and irrelevant atmospheric phenomena was a mark of true navigational mastery. Perhaps most remarkably, the most skilled navigators could often predict the formation of high island clouds before they actually appeared, based on wind conditions, atmospheric pressure, humidity, and other subtle environmental indicators. This predictive ability allowed them to plan their navigation timing more effectively, positioning their vessels to take maximum advantage of cloud signatures when they developed the high clouds that crowned distant islands, thus served as more than simple markers of land. They were complex sources of information about location, distance, identity, topography, weather, and even the timing of approaches. They transformed the vast, empty sky above the Pacific into a readable landscape of aerial signposts, each formation telling its own story to those with the knowledge and patience to interpret their messages. In the language of clouds, these high formations were like the boldest headlines in a vast newspaper written across the sky, announcing two skilled navigators the promise of land beyond the horizon and guiding them safely toward the destinations that awaited beyond the curve of the earth. While the towering cumulus formations above, Thai islands served as dramatic beacons visible from great distances. The subtle world of low clouds and atmospheric shadows presented navigators with a different and equally important category of aerial information. These gentler, more delicate cloud formations spoke of coral atolls, shallow lagoons, and low-lying islands that might remain invisible until a voyaging canoe was almost upon them, yet which could be detected by skilled observers through the careful reading of atmospheric signs so subtle they seemed almost like whispers in the sky. The coral atolls that much of the central Pacific present unique challenges for navigation. Rising only a few feet above sea level, these ring-shaped islands formed by ancient coral growth around long-submerged volcanic peaks can be virtually impossible to spot from sea level until you are within just a few miles of them. Yet for navigators, crossing vast distances between high islands, these atolls served as crucial waypoints, sources of fresh water, safe harbors where crews could rest during long voyages. The atmospheric signatures of low islands and atolls were created by entirely different processes than those that generate the dramatic cloud formations above mountainous islands. Instead of being forced upward by topographic barriers, the air above low islands is influenced by more subtle factors. The difference in temperature between land and water, the reflection of light from shallow lagoons and white coral sand, and the complex patterns of air circulation created by the contrast between solid ground and open ocean. Low coral islands, especially those surrounding large lagoons, create what navigators learn to recognize as lagoon clouds, distinctive formations that appear as subtle discolorations or unusual patterns in the sky above shallow water. These formations are created by the unique optical properties of lagoons, where sunlight penetrates through crystal clear water to illuminate white coral sand below, creating an underwater mirror that reflects light upward with unusual intensity and color characteristics. The phenomenon is most easily understood by imagining the difference between looking up at the sky from beside a deep, dark ocean and looking up from beside a shallow, bright lagoon. The deep ocean absorbs most of the light that strikes it, reflecting very little back into the atmosphere. But a shallow lagoon acts like a giant underwater lamp, bouncing sunlight upward through the clear water and into the air above it. This reflected light subtly illuminates the underside of any clouds that pass over the lagoon, creating what appears to be a faint glow or color change visible to observers. Many miles away, these lagoon signatures were often most apparent during certain times of day and under specific lighting conditions. In the early morning or late afternoon, when the sun's angle was low, the contrast between normal ocean clouds and those illuminated by lagoon reflections became more pronounced. Experienced navigators would time their most careful observations for these periods, scanning the horizon for the telltale signs of lagoon light, painting the sky in subtle but unmistakable patterns. The color characteristics of lagoon clouds provided detailed information about the types of underwater terrain creating them. Clouds above sandy lagoons might show pale yellow or cream-colored tinges. Those over coral gardens could display subtle pinks or whites. Lagoons with significant vegetation might create greenish reflections, while deeper areas within atolls produce different color signatures than the shallow, reef flats surrounding them. Some of the most skilled navigators could distinguish between different types of coral formations based solely on the cloud signatures they created. A continuous barrier reef produced different atmospheric effects than a series of isolated coral heads. The entrance channels that allowed access to lagoons created their own distinctive patterns, often visible as darker streaks or gaps in the otherwise uniform glow of lagoon light. The phenomenon of land looming provided another category of low-altitude atmospheric navigation aids. Even when an island was too low to be seen directly, It could sometimes be detected through the subtle bending of light rays in the atmosphere above it. This atmospheric refraction, similar to the effect that makes objects appear to shimmer on a hot highway, could make low islands appear to float above the horizon, or create the illusion of clouds where none actually existed. Navigators learned to distinguish between true land looming and the many atmospheric mirages that could create similar visual effects. Real land looming had certain characteristics. It appeared and disappeared with predictable timing, showed consistent colors and shapes, and behaved in ways that were different from random atmospheric disturbances. The ability to recognize genuine land looming required years of experience and careful observation. It could extend the effective range of visual navigation by many miles. Low cloud formations also revealed information through their movement, patterns, and persistence, while high island clouds often remained relatively stationary, anchored by the topographic features that created them. Low clouds above atolls and shallow areas moved differently. They might show circular or curved patterns that reflected the shape of the lagoons beneath them. Some formations appeared and disappeared with the tides, growing stronger when shallow areas were exposed and weakening when they were covered by deeper water. The interaction between low clouds and sea breezes provided additional navigational information. Small islands and atolls create their own local wind patterns as differences in temperature between land and water generate air currents. These thermal effects might be too subtle to feel directly, but they could influence cloud formation and movement in ways that revealed the presence of land to observant navigators. Shadow patterns in low cloud formations offered another avenue of information. When partial cloud cover created areas of alternating sun and shadow on the ocean surface, islands in shallow areas responded differently than deep water. Shallow lagoons might remain brighter even when shaded by clouds, while islands could create distinctive shadow patterns that differed from the shadows cast by clouds alone. The seasonal and weather-related variations in low cloud formation provided temporal navigation information that skilled navigators incorporated into their voyage planning. Certain times of year might enhance or diminish the visibility of lagoon clouds. Weather patterns could affect the clarity of atmospheric reflections. Understanding these cycles allowed navigators to time or approaches to low islands for optimal visibility conditions. Perhaps most remarkably, some navigators developed the ability to detect the presence of atolls in shallow areas through combinations of subtle atmospheric indicators that individually might not be conclusive, but together painted a clear picture of hidden land. A slight change in humidity, a subtle shift in the color of the sky, a barely perceptible alteration in the behavior of seabirds, and a faint difference in the sound of waves might combine to indicate the presence of a coral atoll still beyond the range of direct observation. The navigation of passages and channels between coral formations required its own specialized knowledge of cloud reading. The deep channels that provided access to lagoons created different atmospheric signatures than the shallow reef flats surrounding them. Navigators needed to identify not just the presence of an atoll, but the location of safe passages through the coral barriers. Information that could mean the difference between a successful landfall and a disastrous shipwreck on the reef. Low cloud navigation also involved understanding the relationship between atmospheric conditions and ocean conditions. The same shallow waters that created distinctive cloud signatures also affected wave patterns, water color, and the behavior of marine life. Skilled navigators learned to read these multiple information sources simultaneously, creating a comprehensive picture of the underwater landscape from a combination of aerial and oceanic indicators. The mastery of low cloud and lagoon navigation represented one of the most sophisticated aspects of Polynesian wayfinding, requiring not just keen observational skills but an almost intuitive understanding of the subtle relationships between water, light, and atmosphere. These skills allowed navigators to find and safely approach some of the most challenging destinations in the Pacific. Tiny coral islands that offered crucial resources and safe harbors, but which could be deadly traps for those who approached them without the knowledge needed to read their gentle but unmistakable signatures written in light and shadow across the vast canvas of the Pacific sky. in the gentle interplay between ocean and atmosphere that creates the ever-changing canvas of the Pacific sky. Color becomes a language of extraordinary subtlety and precision, speaking to those with trained eyes about the hidden geography that lies beneath the waves and beyond the horizon. The skilled Polynesian navigator learned to read this chromatic vocabulary with the same fluency that we might read written words, finding in the delicate variations of hue and shade a wealth of information about distant islands, shallow lagoons, and underwater landscapes invisible to direct observation. The foundation of color-based navigation lies in understanding how different surfaces interact with sunlight and how that interaction creates distinctive reflective signatures that paint themselves across the sky above. The deep, dark waters of the open Pacific absorb most of the solar energy that strikes them, reflecting back into the atmosphere only a small percentage of the light they receive. This creates the familiar deep blue color of ocean water and maintains the typical appearance of clouds passing over deep seas, white or gray formations against a blue sky, with little distinctive coloration. But when sunlight encounters different types of surfaces, shallow coral reefs, sandy lagoons, vegetation-covered islands, or exposed coral formations, the reflective characteristics change dramatically. Each type of surface has its own spectral signature, reflecting certain wavelengths of light more strongly than others. These reflected wavelengths travel upward through the atmosphere, where they can illuminate the undersides of clouds, tint the sky itself, or create subtle color variations that speak eloquently to trained observers about the nature of the surfaces below. The phenomenon is perhaps most easily understood by considering the dramatic difference between the light environment above a deep ocean and that above a shallow coral lagoon. The deep ocean, appearing almost black when viewed from above, reflects very little light upward. But a shallow lagoon, with its white coral sand bottom visible through crystal clear water, acts like an enormous underwater mirror, bouncing intense light upward through the water column and into the atmosphere above. This upward traveling light carries with it the color characteristics of everything it has encountered: the blue of the water, the white of the sand, the varied hues of coral formations, and sometimes the green of underwater vegetation. When this lagoon-reflected light reaches the atmosphere, it illuminates any clouds that happen to be passing overhead, creating what navigators learn to recognize as the distinctive glow of lagoon light. This illumination is often most visible on the undersides of clouds, where the reflected light from below mingles with the direct sunlight from above to create subtle but unmistakable color variations. A cloud passing over a coral lagoon might show pale, blue, green, or even pinkish tinges that distinguish it clearly from clouds over deep water. The interpretation of these color signatures required sophisticated understanding of how different underwater surfaces created different spectral reflections. Pure white coral sand produced the brightest reflections, often creating pale, almost silvery tinges in the clouds above. Living coral formations added their own colors to the mix: the browns and yellows of certain coral species, the subtle pinks and purples of others. Underwater vegetation contributed green elements, while areas of darker sand or rock might create more muted reflections. Navigators learned to read these color variations like a detailed map of underwater terrain. The navigator observing clouds above an unseen atoll might detect distinct areas of different coloration that revealed the internal geography of the lagoon below. Brighter areas indicated shallow coral gardens or sandy flats. Darker patches suggested deeper channels or areas of rockier bottom. The overall pattern of light and color could reveal not just the presence of an atoll, but its size, the configuration of its lagoon, and even the location of channels that might provide safe passage for a voyaging canoe. The colors reflected from different types of islands also created distinctive atmospheric signatures. High islands covered with dense tropical vegetation reflected strongly in the green portions of the spectrum, often creating subtle greenish tinges in the clouds above them. These green reflections were sometimes visible from surprising distances, announcing the presence of well-forested islands long before any other signs became apparent. The intensity of the green reflection could even provide information about the density and health of the vegetation, indicating islands with abundant freshwater and resources. Sandy beaches and exposed coral platforms created their own reflective signatures. The brilliant white of coral sand could create some of the brightest atmospheric reflections, sometimes visible as distinct white or pale yellow glows in the sky. Different types of sand, coral sand, volcanic sand, or sand mixed with shell fragments, each had their own subtle color characteristics that experienced navigators could distinguish and interpret. The timing of color observations was crucial for accurate navigation. The phenomenon of atmospheric color reflection was most pronounced during certain periods of the day, when the angle of the sun created optimal conditions for observing the subtle color variations in clouds and sky. Early morning and late afternoon often provided the best opportunities, when the lower angle of sunlight enhanced the contrast between reflected colors and the normal blue of the sky. During these optimal periods, navigators would conduct systematic color observations, scanning the horizon for any variations from the normal appearance of ocean clouds. They looked for patches of unusual brightness, subtle color tinges, or areas where the sky appeared different from the uniform blue, typical of open ocean conditions. These variations, even when very faint, could provide the first indication of distant land and guide the navigator toward more detailed observations using other techniques. The seasonal and weather-related variations in atmospheric color also provided temporal navigation information. Different weather conditions affected the clarity and intensity of color reflections. Clear, high-pressure conditions often provided the best opportunities for color observation, while overcast skies might diminish the reflective effects. Understanding these variations allowed navigators to optimize their color reading efforts for conditions when the atmospheric signatures would be most reliable and visible. Some of the most skilled navigators developed the ability to distinguish between the color signatures of islands they had visited before, recognizing the unique atmospheric fingerprints created by familiar destinations. The particular combination of lagoon colors, vegetation reflections, and beach characteristics could create distinctive patterns that served as long-distance identification markers, allowing navigators to confirm not just the presence of land, but the identity of specific islands, while still far from visual range. The interaction between atmospheric colors and watercolors provided another layer of navigational information. The surface of the ocean itself changes color as it approaches different types of underwater terrain. Deep water appears dark blue or purple, but as the bottom becomes shallower, the watercolor shifts through various shades of blue and green. These watercolor changes were often visible before the underwater terrain creating them could be directly observed, providing advance warning of reefs, lagoons, or shelving coastlines. Navigators learned to read the relationship between water, color, and atmospheric color as a unified system of information. Changes in ocean color might precede the development of atmospheric reflections, giving navigators early warning of approaching shallow areas. Conversely, atmospheric color signatures might be visible before watercolor changes became apparent, providing advance information about underwater terrain still too distant to affect surface water appearance. The mastery of color-based navigation represented one of the most subtle and sophisticated aspects of Polynesian wayfinding. It required not just acute visual perception, but deep understanding of optical physics, atmospheric conditions, and the complex relationships between light, water, and various types of surfaces. The navigator who could read the chromatic language of sky and sea possessed a tool of extraordinary precision and range, capable of detecting and interpreting information about distant islands and underwater landscapes through nothing more than the careful observation of color variations so subtle they might be invisible to untrained eyes. This color literacy transformed the vast blue expanse of the Pacific into a richly detailed landscape of information, where every variation in hue and shade told stories about hidden geography and distant destinations. In the hands of master navigators, the interplay of light and color between sea and sky became a navigation system of remarkable accuracy and sophistication, guiding voyaging canoes safely across thousands of miles of ocean toward islands that revealed themselves first, not as land, but as whispered messages written in light across the infinite canvas of the Pacific sky. The true mastery of Polynesian navigation lay not in reading individual signs in isolation, but in understanding how all elements of the natural world worked together as an integrated system of information. Like instruments in a vast ocean orchestra, clouds, winds, and birds created harmonious patterns that, when read together, provided navigational guidance of remarkable precision and reliability. The skilled navigator learned to perceive these interconnected relationships, understanding that a single cloud formation gained meaning through its interaction with bird behavior, wind patterns, and the subtle rhythms of the sea itself. Consider the elegant dance that unfolds each day around a Pacific island as the sun rises and sets. In the early morning, as the first light touches the peaks of a high island, the land begins to warm more quickly than the surrounding ocean. This temperature difference creates subtle but predictable changes in local wind patterns as air heated by the land rises and draws in cooler air from over the water. These thermal currents, in turn, influence cloud formation around the island and create the updrafts and downdrafts that seabirds use for efficient flight. The seabirds themselves serve as living indicators of this complex atmospheric system. Different species of birds have evolved to take advantage of specific wind and weather conditions, and their behavior provides real-time information about atmospheric dynamics that might be invisible to human observers. Frigate birds, with their enormous wingspan and soaring capabilities, are particularly sensitive to thermal currents and updrafts. When these birds are seen circling and gaining altitude effortlessly, it often indicates the presence of rising air currents, the same currents that create or enhance cloud formations above islands. Tropic birds, with their distinctive long tail, streamers rarely venture more than 100 miles from their nesting sites and typically return to land each evening. Their flight patterns throughout the day create aerial pathways that point toward their island homes. But the behavior of tropic birds is also influenced by wind conditions and weather patterns. On days when thermal currents are strong, they might fly higher and more directly. When atmospheric conditions are unstable, they might stay closer to the water or adjust their flight timing. The interaction between bird behavior and cloud formation creates what experienced navigators learn to read as integrated information systems. A navigator might observe tropic birds flying toward a particular section of the horizon in the late afternoon, suggesting the presence of an island in that direction. If, at the same time, he noticed cloud formations developing in the same area, clouds that remained stationary while others moved with the prevailing wind. The combination of these observations would strongly confirm the presence of substantial land in that direction. Boobies, gannets, and other diving seabirds add another layer of information to this natural navigation network. These birds are closely tied to the presence of fish, which in turn are influenced by ocean currents, water temperature, and the underwater topography around islands. When diving birds are active in a particular area, it often indicates underwater features, reefs, seamounts, or shelf areas that affect local marine ecosystems. These same underwater features also influence wave patterns and can create the subtle atmospheric effects that contribute to distinctive cloud formations. The timing of bird activity provides crucial temporal information that navigators learn to coordinate with cloud observations. Many seabirds follow predictable daily schedules, flying out to feeding areas in the morning and returning to roosting sites in the evening. By observing the timing and direction of these flights, navigators could not only determine the direction of nearby land, but also estimate distances. Birds that left early and returned late were likely flying to more distant feeding areas, while those with shorter flight times suggested closer islands. Wind patterns add another essential element too. This integrated navigation system, islands create their own local wind effects, disturbing the regular flow of trade winds in predictable ways. As wind encounters an island, it is deflected around and over the landmass, creating areas of turbulence, wind shadow, and local circulation that can be detected by sensitive observers many miles away. These wind effects interact directly with cloud formation. Areas of upward air movement enhance cloud development, while downdrafts and wind shadows can suppress it. The combination of wind and topography creates what navigators learn to recognize as wind clouds, formations that developed in response to local air circulation rather than general weather patterns. These clouds might appear in consistent locations relative to islands, forming on the windward side where air is lifted up mountain slopes, or in the lie, where complex circulation patterns develop as wind flows around topographic obstacles. This holistic philosophy began with the understanding that an island, even one too distant to be seen, influences its environment in ways that extend far beyond its visible boundaries. A large island creates its own weather patterns, effects. The behavior of ocean swells attracts certain types of sea life and provides roosting places for birds whose daily flights create invisible highways across the ocean. To the trained navigator, these influences were as clear and reliable as road signs, pointing the way toward land that might still be dozens of miles away. Consider how an island interacts with the ocean around it. When the long rolling swells that travel thousands of miles across the Pacific encounter an island, they don't simply stop, they bend around it, creating complex patterns of reflection and refraction that can be detected by sensitive observers many miles away from the island itself. These wave patterns, called te lapa in some Polynesian languages, create underwater light phenomena that skilled navigators could see and interpret even on the darkest nights. The navigator learned to feel these wave patterns through the hull of his canoe, reading in the subtle changes of motion and rhythm a story of distant land. A particular type of crosswell might indicate an island to the southwest. A certain frequency of wave interference could suggest the presence of a shallow reef system ahead. The way the canoe rode, the swells, the particular rhythm of its rise and fall, spoke to the navigator of underwater geography that no surface observation could reveal. But waves were just one element in the vast natural library that navigators learned to read. The wind itself carried information, not just in its direction and strength, but in its smell, its temperature, and its humidity. Land creates distinctive scent signatures that can travel surprising distances over water. The smell of vegetation, the particular fragrance of flowering trees, even the earthy scent of soil, could reach a navigator's sensitive nose hours or even days before the island itself became visible. Birds provided another crucial layer of information in this natural navigation system. Different species of seabirds have different flight patterns, feeding behaviors, and daily routines. Some birds never venture more than a certain distance from land, so spotting them could indicate proximity to an island. Others make regular flights between roosting areas on land and feeding areas at sea, creating aerial pathways that navigators could follow. The time of day when certain birds appeared, the direction they were flying, even their behavior and calls, all provided clues about nearby land. Navigators learned to recognize the flight patterns of frigate birds, which roost on land at night, but might feed 40 or 50 miles out to sea during the day. Seeing frigate birds flying toward the horizon in the early morning suggested land in that direction. Observing them returning in the late afternoon confirmed it. Tropic birds, with their distinctive long-tail feathers, rarely ventured more than 100 miles from their nesting sites, making their presence a reliable indicator of relatively nearby land. Even more subtle were the clues provided by sea life itself. Certain species of fish were associated with specific types of underwater terrain. Schools of tuna might indicate deep water channels between islands. Different types of dolphins were known to frequent different oceanic environments. The presence of particular types of floating seaweed, or the specific colors and clarity of the water itself, told stories about currents, depths, and the proximity of land. The color of the sea was itself a language that navigators learned to read fluently. Deep ocean water appears dark blue or even purple, but as water becomes shallower, its color changes subtly through various shades of blue and green. These color changes, visible to trained eyes from surprising distances, could indicate the presence of underwater reefs, shallow lagoons, or shelving coastlines long before the land itself became apparent. Temperature was another important indicator. Land masses, especially larger islands, create their own thermal environments. The air temperature might change subtly as a canoe approached an island, even when it was still beyond the horizon. Water temperature could also vary near land, influenced by shallow areas, freshwater springs, or the thermal mass of the island itself. Perhaps most remarkably, navigators learned to use phosphorescence in the water as a navigational aid. The tiny organisms that create this underwater light show behave differently in different oceanic conditions. Near islands, the patterns of phosphorescence might change, creating underwater light signatures that could be read and interpreted by those who knew what to look for. All of these natural phenomena, waves, winds, birds, sea life, watercolor, temperature, even phosphorescence, were not isolated indicators, but parts of an integrated system that navigators learned to read as a unified whole. Particular combination of wave patterns, bird behavior, and watercolor might point unmistakably toward a specific type of island at a specific distance. The art lay not just in recognizing individual signs, but in understanding how they all work together to tell a coherent story about the marine environment. This approach to navigation required a fundamentally different way of thinking about space and location. Rather than trying to determine precise coordinates on an abstract grid, Polynesian navigators thought in terms of relationships and processes. They didn't ask, "Where am I?" so much as "What is happening around me and what does it mean?" Their navigation was dynamic and responsive, constantly adapting to new information and changing conditions. The training required to develop this level of sensitivity and understanding was enormous. Young navigators might spend decades learning to read the natural world with the precision required for successful ocean voyaging. They developed what we might call a sixth sense for the subtle patterns and relationships that connected all elements of the marine environment, learning to perceive signals so delicate that they were invisible to untrained observers. In this way of navigation, nature itself became the map, the compass, the GPS, and the weather forecast, all combined into one living, breathing system of information. Every wave, every cloud, every bird, every change in the color or smell of the sea was a piece of data in a vast natural database that stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, connecting islands separated by distances that seemed impossible to cross, yet which skilled navigators traversed with confidence born of deep understanding and patient observation. Above the endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean, where the sky meets the sea in an unbroken circle of blue, clouds drift and form in patterns that seem random to the casual observer, but to the trained eyes of Polynesian navigators, these same clouds spoke a language as clear and precise as any human tongue. A language that could guide them across thousands of miles of open water to islands they had never seen, using nothing more than the patient observation of the sky above their heads. The study of clouds for navigation, what we might call navigation, represents perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Polynesian wayfinding. While stars provided the basic framework for direction and seasonal timing, and ocean swells offered clues about distant land masses, it was often the clouds that provided the final, crucial information needed to locate specific islands and guide the navigator safely to his destination. To understand how clouds could serve as navigational aids, we must first appreciate the intimate relationship between land and sky in the tropical Pacific. Islands don't simply exist in isolation. They actively shape the atmosphere above them, creating distinctive cloud formations that can be seen and interpreted from distances far greater than the islands themselves are visible. These cloud signatures are created by the complex interactions between land masses and the atmosphere, resulting in patterns that are both predictable and distinctive. The foundation of cloud navigation lies in understanding how islands influence local weather patterns. When the steady trade winds that blow across the Pacific encounter a landmass, they don't simply flow around it, they are forced upward by the island's topography. As this air rises, it cools, and the moisture it carries begins to condense into clouds. The size, shape, and persistence of these clouds depend on the characteristics of the island below: its height, its area, its topography, and even its vegetation. Large, High islands with significant mountains create what navigators learned to recognize as standing clouds, formations that remain relatively stationary because they are constantly being regenerated by the island's effect on the passing air masses. These standing clouds can be visible from distances of over 100 miles on clear days, serving as beacons that mark the presence of substantial land masses long before the islands themselves appear above the horizon. But cloud navigation involved far more than simply spotting these obvious formations. Navigators learned to read subtle variations in cloud behavior that revealed the presence of smaller islands, low atolls, and even underwater reefs. They understood that different types of land masses created different types of cloud signatures, and they could often determine not just the presence of land, but its size, height, and even its general characteristics based solely on the clouds above it. Rada's voyage demonstrates the integration of multiple navigation techniques, showing how legendary navigators combined cloud reading with bird behavior, wave patterns, and other natural indicators to achieve remarkable precision in their navigation. The stories describe how he would time his cloud observations to coordinate with the daily flights of seabirds, using the birds to confirm and refine the information provided by atmospheric signs. The legend of Tangaroa Kiwi tells of a navigation challenge that tested the limits of cloud reading skills, finding a specific island in a chain of similar atolls, where the atmospheric signatures were so similar that distinguishing between them required extraordinary subtlety of observation. The oral traditions describe how Tangaroa Kiwi learned to read minute differences in cloud coloration and timing, distinguishing between islands that created nearly identical atmospheric effects. This legendary voyage illustrates the sophistication that Polynesian cloud navigation could achieve. Tangaroa Kiwi supposedly could identify individual islands within atoll chains by observing subtle variations in how their lagoons reflected light into the atmosphere. He learned to time his observations to take advantage of specific lighting conditions that enhanced these minimal differences, demonstrating cloud reading skills that bordered on the supernatural in their precision. The story of Maui's fishing up of islands represents perhaps the most mythologized of the legendary navigational tales, but even within its supernatural framework, it preserves important information about cloud navigation techniques. The oral traditions describe how Maui used cloud signs to locate underwater seamounts and shallow areas where new islands might be caught, formations that created distinctive atmospheric effects due to their influence on local weather patterns. In ocean conditions, these mythological elements, clearly fantastical in their literal interpretation, preserve practical knowledge about how navigators used cloud reading to identify promising areas for island discovery. The descriptions of how Maui baited his hook with observations of cloud behavior encode real techniques for using atmospheric signs to locate underwater topography that might indicate the presence of undiscovered land. The voyage traditions of the great navigator Tafai describe journeys that pushed the boundaries of distance navigation, using cloud reading techniques to maintain course accuracy over voyages lasting many weeks. The oral traditions preserve detailed descriptions of how Tafai used seasonal changes in cloud patterns to time his voyages for optimal navigation conditions, planning his journeys to take advantage of atmospheric clarity and distinctive island signatures. Tafia's legendary skills included the ability to predict cloud formation patterns days in advance, allowing him to position his vessel to take maximum advantage of atmospheric signs when they appeared. The oral traditions describe how he integrated weather prediction with cloud navigation, using his understanding of seasonal atmospheric cycles to enhance the reliability of his cloud reading techniques. Perhaps most remarkably, some of the legendary voyages describe navigators who developed techniques for reading clouds at night, using reflected starlight and moonlight to observe subtle atmospheric variations that were invisible during daylight hours. These night cloud reading techniques required extraordinary visual sensitivity and deep understanding of how different types of reflected light created detectable atmospheric effects. The legend of Ngahu describes a navigator who supposedly could identify islands by the way they affected star visibility, reading the subtle dimming or brightening of celestial bodies as they passed behind. atmospheric formations created by distant land, while clearly requiring skills that pushed beyond normal human capabilities. These stories preserve the concept that cloud effects could be detected through multiple sensory channels. Not just direct visual observation, these legendary voyages, whether historically accurate in their details or mythologized representations of real navigational achievements, demonstrate the extraordinary sophistication that Polynesian wildly cloud navigation could achieve in the hands of master practitioners. They show how cloud reading skills could be pushed to remarkable limits, enabling voyages across distances that seem impossible even by modern standards. The oral preservation of these legendary journeys serves multiple purposes beyond simple entertainment. The stories encode practical navigational knowledge within memorable narrative frameworks, ensuring that important techniques and principles would be preserved even when the specific skills were not actively practiced. They also provide inspiration and models for aspiring navigators, showing what could be achieved through dedication, skill, deep understanding of natural patterns. As we continue our peaceful drift through the star-filled Pacific night, these legendary voyages remind us of the extraordinary human achievement represented by Polynesian navigation. In an age before instruments, before written records, before any of the technological aids we take for granted, skilled navigators used nothing more than their trained senses and deep understanding of natural patterns to achieve feats of navigation that still inspire wonder and respect. The clouds that guided these legendary voyagers continued to drift across the Pacific sky, carrying the same information, creating the same atmospheric signatures, waiting for eyes trained to read their subtle language. In their formations and movements, in their colors and patterns, the ancient wisdom of navigation lives on, a testament to human ingenuity and the patient observation of the natural world that surrounds us all, across the ancient world, wherever human beings ventured onto the open seas. They developed ingenious methods for finding their way across vast distances using the natural world as their guide. Yet when we compare the navigation systems developed by different maritime cultures, the sophisticated cloud reading techniques of Polynesian navigators stand apart as a unique achievement, representing perhaps the most advanced form of atmospheric navigation ever developed by any seafaring people. In the Mediterranean Sea, the cradle of Western maritime tradition, ancient Greek and Phoenician navigators developed sophisticated techniques for ocean navigation that served them well in their more confined waters. These skilled sailors learned to read wind patterns, to recognize the distinctive characteristics of different coastlines, and to use the stars for directional guidance during their voyages between known ports and established trading centers. The Mediterranean navigators became masters of coastal navigation, developing detailed knowledge of harbor approaches, seasonal wind patterns, and the distinctive landmarks that marked safe passages through familiar waters. They learned to read the color changes that indicated different water depths, to recognize the types of seabirds that suggested proximity to specific coasts, and to use the positions of stars for maintaining general direction during overnight passages. However, the Mediterranean's relatively small size and the presence of numerous islands and coastlines created a navigational environment fundamentally different from the vast Pacific Ocean. Mediterranean navigators rarely needed to venture far from sight of land, and when they did undertake longer voyages, they could rely on well-established routes between known destinations. This geographical reality meant that the extreme long-distance navigation techniques developed by Polynesian navigators were simply not necessary in the Mediterranean world. Most significantly, Mediterranean navigators did not develop systematic cloud reading techniques comparable to those used in the Pacific. While they certainly observed weather patterns and used cloud formations to predict storms and wind changes, they did not need to read clouds as indicators of distant land masses. In the Mediterranean's island-rich environment, direct visual contact with coastlines provided more reliable navigation information than atmospheric observations in the Indian Ocean. Arab and Persian navigators developed navigation systems that incorporated some elements similar to Polynesian techniques, but with important differences that reflected the unique characteristics of their maritime environment. These skilled navigators, who connected the coasts of Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia in vast trading networks, developed sophisticated understanding of monsoon patterns and seasonal weather systems. Indian ocean navigators became experts at reading wind patterns and ocean currents, timing their voyages to take advantage of predictable seasonal changes that could carry their vessels efficiently across vast distances. They developed detailed knowledge of the relationship between weather patterns and navigation, understanding how seasonal atmospheric changes affected both wind direction and the reliability of other navigational indicators. Some Indian Ocean navigation traditions included elements of atmospheric observation that paralleled certain Polynesian techniques. Arab navigators learned to recognize the distinctive cloud formations that indicated the approach to the East African coast. They developed techniques for using atmospheric haze and color changes to estimate distances to familiar landmarks. Seasonal wind patterns added temporal depth to the navigators' understanding of these integrated systems. During certain times of year, changes in prevailing wind direction might alter the characteristic cloud formations of familiar islands. The same island might create dramatically different atmospheric signatures in different seasons as the interaction between topography and wind changed. Master navigators incorporated these seasonal variations into their knowledge, understanding that successful navigation required adapting to temporal changes in the natural systems they depended upon. The relationship between wind, waves, and atmospheric conditions created additional layers of navigational information. Wind generates waves. The interaction between waves and islands creates complex patterns that can be felt through the hull of a canoe long before the island itself becomes visible. These wave patterns, in turn, influence local wind conditions and can contribute to the development of distinctive cloud formations. A navigator might feel characteristic wave patterns beneath his vessel, observe specific wind behaviors, and see confirming cloud signatures, all pointing toward the same conclusion about the presence and location of land, storm systems, and weather. Fronts provided dramatic examples of how atmospheric, oceanic, and biological systems interact on larger scales. Approaching weather often announces itself through changes in cloud formations, wind patterns, and the behavior of seabirds. Birds might alter their flight patterns in response to atmospheric pressure changes that precede visible weather development. Cloud formations might change character as atmospheric stability shifts. Understanding these relationships allowed navigators to anticipate weather changes and plan their navigation accordingly. The most sophisticated navigators developed what might be called environmental intuition, the ability to perceive the overall state of the marine ecosystem and atmospheric system as a unified whole. They could sense when conditions were right for certain types of observations, when atmospheric clarity would enhance cloud reading, when bird behavior would be most reliable, and when the integration of multiple information sources would provide the clearest navigational guidance. This integrated approach to navigation created redundancy and reliability that no single technique could provide. If cloud observations were obscured by weather, bird behavior might still provide directional information. If winds were light and difficult to read, cloud formations might be more stable and easier to interpret. The combination of multiple information sources allowed navigators to cross-check their observations and maintain confidence in their navigation, even under challenging conditions. Perhaps most remarkably, the integration of birds, winds, and clouds created what amounted to an early warning system for land. Long before an island became directly visible, changes in bird behavior might announce its presence. These behavioral changes would be followed by subtle alterations in wind patterns, which in turn would influence cloud development. By the time distinctive cloud formations became visible, the navigator would already receive multiple confirmations of the island's presence and location. The mastery of this integrated, natural navigation system represented the pinnacle of Polynesian wayfinding skill. It required not just knowledge of individual phenomena, but wisdom about their relationships and interactions. The navigator who could read the conversations between wind and cloud, between bird and weather, between Island and atmosphere possessed a tool of extraordinary sophistication. A living navigation system that transformed the vast Pacific into a readable landscape of interconnected signs and signals, all working together to guide voyaging canoes safely across the ocean toward their distant destinations, in a world where the vast ocean served as both highway and home, where the lives of entire communities depended on the ability to find tiny islands across thousands of miles of open water. The knowledge of navigation was too precious to be left to chance or individual discovery. The wisdom that allowed Polynesian navigators to read clouds like books, to understand the language of wind and wave, to find their way across the trackless Pacific using nothing more than their senses and their deep understanding of natural patterns. This knowledge was preserved, transmitted, and refined through one of the most sophisticated educational systems ever developed by a non-literate society. The training of a navigator began not with formal lessons, but with a lifetime of casual observation and gradual immersion in the maritime culture that surrounded every aspect of Polynesian life. Children growing up in voyaging communities absorbed navigational knowledge as naturally as they learned to walk and speak. They watched the behavior of adults who studied the sky each morning and evening, noting the correlation between cloud formations and wind changes, observing how experienced navigators timed fishing trips and interland journeys based on subtle, environmental cues. From their earliest years, potential navigators learned to see the natural world with unusual sensitivity and attention to detail. They were encouraged to notice patterns that others might ignore, the way certain birds behaved before weather changes, how clouds formed differently over various types of islands, the subtle differences in wave patterns that spoke of distant land. This early training created a foundation of observational skill that would be essential for the more advanced instruction that would follow. The selection of candidates for formal navigator training was a serious process that considered not just intellectual ability, but temperament, dedication, and what might be called navigational intuition. Not everyone possessed the particular combination of patience, perception, and mental discipline required for the decades of study that lay ahead. Those who showed promise were gradually drawn into more intensive observation activities, spending increasing amounts of time with master navigators who began to test their pupils' ability to see and remember the subtle patterns that others missed. The formal education of a navigator was built around oral instruction that was far more sophisticated than simple storytelling or the recitation of facts. The knowledge was encoded in chants, songs, and ritual performances that served multiple purposes simultaneously. These oral forms made complex information easier to memorize by providing rhythm, petition, and mnemonic structures that helped preserve accurate details across generations. But they also embedded navigational knowledge within spiritual and cultural contexts that gave it deeper meaning and ensured it would be treated with appropriate respect. Star compass chants, for example, encoded not just the positions and movements of celestial bodies, but their relationships to seasonal weather patterns, island locations, and the optimal timing for different types of voyages. These chants might take years to master completely, as they required not just memorization, but deep understanding of the astronomical and geographical relationships they described. A student might spend months learning to recite a single chant perfectly, then years more learning to understand all the practical applications of the knowledge it contained. Cloud navigation knowledge was preserved in equally sophisticated oral forms. Chants described the characteristic cloud formations of different islands, the seasonal variations in atmospheric patterns, the relationships between cloud behavior and wind systems, but this information was not presented as simple lists of facts. Instead, it was woven into narrative forms that told the stories of legendary voyages, described the creation of islands and their distinctive atmospheric signatures, and connected cloud reading skills to the broader cultural and spiritual frameworks that gave Polynesian navigation its deeper meaning. The training methods used by master navigators were designed to develop not just knowledge but wisdom, the ability to apply information flexibly and appropriately under the constantly changing conditions of actual ocean voyaging. Students learned through careful observation and guided practice rather than abstract instruction, A master navigator might spend months teaching his student to distinguish between different types of cloud formations by having him observe the sky every day at specific times, noting subtle differences in color, texture, movement, and persistence. Much of the instruction took place during actual voyages, where students could observe the application of navigational principles under real conditions. These training voyages were carefully planned to provide exposure to different types of navigational challenges while maintaining reasonable safety margins. A student might accompany his master on progressively longer and more difficult journeys, gradually taking on greater responsibility for navigation decisions as his skills and confidence developed. The memorization techniques used in navigator training were remarkably sophisticated, incorporating multiple sensory channels and learning methods to ensure accurate preservation of complex information. Students learned not just to recite chants, but to visualize the celestial and geographical relationships they described. They practiced drawing star maps and island configurations in sand, reinforcing verbal learning with visual and kinesthetic memory systems. Some of the most important navigational knowledge was preserved in the form of sacred chants and rituals that could only be learned by initiated navigators. These secret teachings often contained the most precise and detailed information about specific voyage routes, the locations of rarely visited islands, and the subtle techniques that distinguish master navigators from competent practitioners. The restriction of this knowledge to qualified initiates ensured both its preservation and its responsible use. The relationship between master and student and navigator training was intensely personal and often lifelong. Master navigator typically worked with only a few students during his career, investing years or even decades in their education. This intimate teaching relationship allowed for the transmission not just of technical knowledge, but of the subtle judgments, intuitive insights, and hard-won wisdom that could only be shared through prolonged association and careful observation. Students learned to internalize their master's decision-making processes by observing how he responded to different combinations of environmental conditions. They watched how he weighed conflicting information from different sources, how he adjusted his navigation strategies based on seasonal changes, weather developments, and the specific requirements of different types of voyages. This apprenticeship model ensured that navigational knowledge remained practical and adaptive rather than becoming rigid doctrine. The testing and certification of navigators glowed practical demonstrations of skill under challenging conditions. A student might be required to navigate to a specific island using only natural signs, to predict weather changes days in advance based on atmospheric observations, or to identify familiar islands from their cloud signatures alone. These tests were designed not just to verify technical competence, but to confirm the student's readiness to accept the enormous responsibility of guiding others safely across the ocean. Advanced training involved the study of rare and unusual conditions that might be encountered only occasionally during a navigator's career. Students learned to recognize the signs of approaching hurricanes, to navigate during periods when normal stellar references were obscured by weather, and to adapt their techniques for voyages to distant island groups with different geographical and atmospheric characteristics. This advanced knowledge prepared navigators for the exceptional situations that could mean the difference between successful voyaging and disaster. The preservation of navigational knowledge also involved complex social and cultural mechanisms that ensured continuity across generations. Navigator families often maintained hereditary responsibilities for specific knowledge areas or voyage routes. Communities invested collectively in the education of navigators, recognizing that their survival depended on maintaining these essential skills. The social status accorded to master navigators reflected not just respect for their abilities, but recognition of their crucial role in maintaining the connections that held Polynesian civilization together. Perhaps most remarkably, the oral, a tradition that preserved Polynesian navigational knowledge, also allowed for its continuous refinement and adaptation. Unlike written records that might become outdated or inaccurate, oral instruction could incorporate new discoveries, seasonal variations, and improved techniques as they were developed. Master navigators could adapt their teaching to account for environmental changes. New island discoveries or innovations in voyaging technology, ensuring that navigational knowledge remained current and effective. The result of this sophisticated educational system was a class of navigators whose skills bordered on the supernatural in their precision and reliability. These men, and they were typically men, though some women also achieved navigational mastery, could guide voyaging canoes across thousands of miles of open ocean with accuracy that rivals modern GPS systems. Using nothing more than their carefully trained senses and the accumulated wisdom of countless generations of ocean voyagers, the oral traditions that preserved and transmitted this knowledge represented one of humanity's greatest educational achievements. A system that maintained complex technical information across centuries without writing, while simultaneously preserving the cultural and spiritual context that gave navigation its deeper meaning in Polynesian society. Through chant and story, ritual and practice, master and student, the wisdom of cloud reading and ocean voyaging passed from generation to generation, ensuring that the skills needed to maintain connections across the vast Pacific would never be lost to the communities that depended on them for their very survival. In the vast library of Polynesian memory, where stories were treasured more than gold and wisdom passed down through generations like precious heirlooms, certain tales stand out as monuments to the extraordinary skill of the ancient navigators. These are the legendary voyages, journeys that stretched across impossible distances, guided by nothing more than the patient reading of clouds and the deep understanding of how sky and sea work together to reveal the locations of distant lands. Perhaps the most famous of these legendary journeys tells of Cuyp, the great Macquarie navigator who followed cloud signs to discover what we now know as New Zealand. According to the oral traditions preserved by generations of storytellers, Cuyp's voyage began not with a planned expedition, but with a pursuit. He was following the giant octopus Te Wika Muchirangi, which had been stealing fish from the nets of his people. Day after day, the massive creature led Cuyp's vessel further and further from familiar waters, drawing him into regions of the Pacific that no Polynesian had ever explored. As we drift peacefully on our imaginary ocean, we can picture Cuyp's canoe cutting through the swells, its crew scanning the horizon for signs of their quarry. But it was not the octopus that ultimately guided them to their historic discovery. It was the clouds. Far to the south, where the horizon met the sky, in an unbroken line of blue, Cuyp observed formations that behaved differently from the normal patterns of ocean weather. These clouds appeared stationary while others moved with the wind, and they showed the distinctive white coloration that experienced navigators associated with the reflection of light from snow-covered mountains. The clouds that called to Cuyp across the vast distance spoke of land unlike anything in the tropical Pacific. They were the atmospheric signatures of mountains capped with snow, of temperate forests and deep fjords, of a landmass so large that it created weather systems visible from hundreds of miles away. Following these cloud signs through weeks of careful navigation, Cuyp and his crew became the first Polynesians to see the dramatic coastlines of Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud. Another legendary voyage tells of Huataranjora, who may have been the first Polynesian navigator to venture into Antarctic waters. Guided by cloud formations that revealed the presence of ice fields and glaciers far to the south of New Zealand, as the oral traditions describe his observations of clouds that glowed with unusual brightness, reflecting light from vast expanses of white ice. These clouds appeared different from any others the navigators had seen, their undersides illuminated by the intense reflectivity of the polar environment. The story of Huataranjora's journey describes how the clouds gradually changed character. As his vessel traveled further south, the familiar tropical formations gave way to different types of atmospheric displays. Lower, more persistent clouds that spoke of colder temperatures and different weather patterns. The navigators observed how these southern clouds moved with different rhythms, how their colors changed throughout the day in ways that differed from the tropical patterns they knew so well. These legendary southern voyages required adaptations in cloud reading that pushed the boundaries of traditional Polynesian navigation. The navigators had to learn new atmospheric vocabularies, understanding how ice and snow created different reflective signatures than coral and vegetation. They developed techniques for reading cloud formations in regions where the familiar island signatures were replaced by the aerial traces of glaciers, icebergs, and vast continental landmasses. The voyage of Rada represents another class of legendary journey, the discovery of new island chains through the systematic following of bird and cloud combinations. According to the oral traditions, Rada observed tropic birds flying consistently toward a particular section of the horizon where subtle cloud formations suggested the presence of distant land. Rather than following the birds directly, he used their flight patterns to guide his attention to atmospheric signs that might otherwise have been too subtle to notice. The clouds that led Rata to his discoveries were not the obvious formations created by high volcanic islands, but the delicate signatures of low coral atolls. The oral traditions describe how he learned to recognize the faint discolorations in the sky that indicated shallow lagoons, how he distinguished between the cloud patterns that suggested solid land and those that might indicate dangerous reefs or underwater obstacles. However, the Indian Ocean navigation systems relied more heavily on instrumental aids than Polynesian techniques. Arab navigators used astrolabes and other measuring devices to determine latitude, and they developed written sailing directions that recorded detailed information about routes, wind patterns, and navigation hazards. This reliance on instruments and written records, while highly effective for their purposes, represented a fundamentally different approach from the purely observational methods of Polynesian navigation. The monsoon-driven nature of Indian Ocean sailing also created different requirements for navigation techniques. The predictable seasonal wind patterns meant that navigators could plan voyages around established weather cycles, reducing the need for the kind of real-time environmental observation that was essential in the Pacific's more variable conditions. The North Atlantic Viking navigators developed remarkable skills for long-distance ocean voyaging that enabled them to reach Iceland, Greenland, and North America centuries before Columbus. These hardy seafarers learned to use a combination of stellar observation, wave pattern reading, and wildlife behavior to guide their vessels across some of the world's most challenging waters. Viking navigation techniques included some elements that paralleled Polynesian methods, particularly in their use of wildlife behavior as navigation aids. Viking navigators learned to recognize the flight patterns of different seabirds, using ravens and other species to locate land beyond the horizon. They developed techniques for reading wave patterns and ocean swells, understanding how these could indicate the presence of distant coastlines. However, Viking cloud navigation was primarily focused on weather prediction rather than land location. In the often stormy North Atlantic, the ability to predict approaching weather systems was more crucial for survival than reading atmospheric signs of distant land. Viking navigators became experts at recognizing cloud formations that indicated approaching storms. But they did not develop the systematic island detection techniques that characterized Polynesian navigation. The use of crystal sunstones by Viking navigators represents an interesting parallel to Polynesian techniques, as these optical aids allowed them to determine sun position even through heavy cloud cover. However, this represents the use of tools to overcome atmospheric obstacles rather than the Polynesian approach of reading the atmosphere itself as a source of navigation information. In the North Pacific, the Inuit and other Arctic peoples developed navigation techniques adapted to their unique environment of sea ice, polar weather, and extreme seasonal variations. These navigators learned to read wind patterns, ice formations, and atmospheric conditions with extraordinary skill. But their techniques were adapted to coastal and near-coastal navigation rather than open ocean voyaging. Inuit navigators developed sophisticated understanding of how weather patterns affected ice formation and movement, and they learned to use atmospheric phenomena like ice blink and cloud formations associated with ice fields for navigation. However, these techniques were adapted to finding leads through ice fields and locating coastlines rather than the open ocean island finding that characterized Polynesian navigation. What makes Polynesian cloud navigation unique among world navigation Systems is its systematic development of techniques for reading atmospheric signs as indicators of distant land masses in an open ocean environment. While other maritime cultures developed sophisticated weather reading skills, none developed comparable methods for using cloud formations to locate previously unknown islands across vast distances. The Pacific Ocean's unique characteristics. Its enormous size, the scattered distribution of small islands, and the relatively predictable weather patterns created by trade wind systems created conditions where cloud navigation techniques could develop to their full potential. The necessity of finding tiny islands across vast distances drove Polynesian navigators to develop atmospheric reading skills that were simply not required in other maritime environments. The integration of cloud reading with other observational techniques also sets Polynesian navigation apart from other systems. While many cultures develop skills in reading stars, waves, or wildlife behavior, the Polynesian synthesis of all these techniques into a unified navigation system represents a unique achievement in maritime technology. Perhaps most remarkably, the Polynesian navigation system achieved its sophistication without relying on any manufactured instruments or written records. While other advanced navigation systems use tools like astrolabes, compasses, or written sailing directions, Polynesian navigators achieved comparable or superior results. Using only trained observation and memorized knowledge, the oral preservation and transmission of Polynesian navigation knowledge also represents a unique achievement among world navigation systems. While other cultures developed written navigation texts and instrumental techniques that could be learned from books, the Polynesian system maintained its sophistication across generations through purely oral instruction, creating one of the most advanced technical knowledge systems ever preserved without writing. This comparison illuminates why Polynesian navigation, and particularly the cloud reading techniques that were central to it, represent such a remarkable achievement in human history. While every maritime culture that survived developed effective navigation techniques suited to their environment, the Polynesian system achieved a level of sophistication and precision that enabled voyages across distances that challenged even modern navigation systems. Using nothing more than careful observation of the natural world and the accumulated wisdom of countless generations of skilled practitioners, as we drift peacefully through our Pacific night, surrounded by the same stars and clouds that guided those ancient navigators, we can appreciate the extraordinary human achievement represented by their skills. Techniques that transformed the vast ocean from an empty barrier into a readable landscape of information, enabling some of the greatest voyages of discovery in human history. The gentle wisdom that had guided Polynesian navigators across the vast Pacific for over 1,000 years began to fade, not with a dramatic ending, but with the quiet arrival of new technologies and changing ways of life that gradually made the ancient skills seem less necessary, less relevant to communities adapting to a rapidly changing world. The decline of traditional navigation represents one of history's great losses of human knowledge. It's the disappearance of skills so sophisticated and precise that they seem almost magical to our modern understanding. The first signs of change came with the arrival of European explorers in the Pacific, beginning in the 16th century and intensifying through the 18th and 19th centuries. These newcomers brought with them metal instruments, written charts, and magnetic compasses that offered different approaches to ocean navigation. Two communities that had navigated successfully for generations using traditional methods. These new tools initially seemed curious, but unnecessary. Interesting novelties that could supplement but hardly replace the proven wisdom of cloud reading and stellar observation. Captain James Cook's voyages in the 1770s marked a turning point in this cultural encounter. Cook's ships carried Tahitian navigators, including the famous Tupaya, who demonstrated traditional navigation techniques that amazed and impressed the European sailors. Tupaya could draw accurate maps from memory, showing the locations of islands across hundreds of miles of ocean. And he could navigate effectively using traditional methods even when European instruments failed or provided contradictory information. Yet, even as European observers marveled at these traditional skills, the presence of metal ships, magnetic compasses, and written charts began to influence Polynesian navigation practices. Young navigators who might once have spent decades learning to read clouds and stars found themselves drawn to European techniques that seemed to promise quicker results with less intensive training. The establishment of European colonial administrations across the Pacific accelerated this process of change. Colonial governments, with their emphasis on written records, standardized procedures, and European-style education systems, had little understanding of or patience for traditional knowledge systems that were preserved entirely in memory and transmitted through oral instruction. Traditional navigators found their social status changing as colonial administrators elevated those who could work within European systems of commerce, law, and administration. The communities that had once revered master navigators as essential figures began to see greater advantage in acquiring European-style education and skills. The long apprenticeships required for traditional navigation began to seem like inefficient uses of time that could be better spent learning to read, write, and work within colonial economic systems. The introduction of regular, steamship services between islands created perhaps the most fundamental challenge to traditional navigation, when scheduled ships began connecting major Pacific islands on predictable timetables. The need for skilled navigators to guide voyaging canoes across vast distances diminished dramatically. Communities could now rely on European vessels for transportation and communication, reducing their dependence on traditional voyaging skills. Rada's voyage demonstrates the integration of multiple navigation techniques, showing how legendary navigators combined cloud reading with bird behavior, wave patterns, and other natural indicators to achieve remarkable precision in their navigation. The stories describe how he would time his cloud observations to coordinate with the daily flights of seabirds, using the birds to confirm and refine the information provided by atmospheric signs. The legend of Tangaroa Kiwi tells of a navigation challenge that tested the limits of cloud reading skills, finding a specific island in a chain of similar atolls, where the atmospheric signatures were so similar that distinguishing between them required extraordinary subtlety of observation. The oral traditions describe how Tangaroa Kiwi learned to read minute differences in cloud coloration and timing, distinguishing between islands that created nearly identical atmospheric effects. This legendary voyage illustrates the sophistication that Polynesian cloud navigation could achieve. Tangaroa Kiwi supposedly could identify individual islands within atoll chains by observing subtle variations in how their lagoons reflected light into the atmosphere. He learned to time his observations to take advantage of specific lighting conditions that enhanced these minimal differences, demonstrating cloud reading skills that bordered on the supernatural in their precision. The story of Maui's fishing up of islands represents perhaps the most mythologized of the legendary navigational tales, but even within its supernatural framework, it preserves important information about cloud navigation techniques. The oral traditions describe how Maui used cloud signs to locate underwater seamounts and shallow areas where new islands might be caught, formations that created distinctive atmospheric effects due to their influence on local weather patterns. In ocean conditions, these mythological elements, clearly fantastical in their literal interpretation, preserve practical knowledge about how navigators used cloud reading to identify promising areas for island discovery. The descriptions of how Maui baited his hook with observations of cloud behavior encode real techniques for using atmospheric signs to locate underwater topography that might indicate the presence of undiscovered land. The voyage traditions of the great navigator Tafai describe journeys that pushed the boundaries of distance navigation, using cloud reading techniques to maintain course accuracy over voyages lasting many weeks. The oral traditions preserve detailed descriptions of how Tafai used seasonal changes in cloud patterns to time his voyages for optimal navigation conditions, planning his journeys to take advantage of atmospheric clarity and distinctive island signatures. Tafia's legendary skills included the ability to predict cloud formation patterns days in advance, allowing him to position his vessel to take maximum advantage of atmospheric signs when they appeared. The oral traditions describe how he integrated weather prediction with cloud navigation, using his understanding of seasonal atmospheric cycles to enhance the reliability of his cloud reading techniques. Perhaps most remarkably, some of the legendary voyages describe navigators who developed techniques for reading clouds at night, using reflected starlight and moonlight to observe subtle atmospheric variations that were invisible during daylight hours. These night cloud reading techniques required extraordinary visual sensitivity and deep understanding of how different types of reflected light created detectable atmospheric effects. The legend of Ngahu describes a navigator who supposedly could identify islands by the way they affected star visibility, reading the subtle dimming or brightening of celestial bodies as they passed behind atmospheric formations created by distant land, while clearly requiring skills that pushed beyond normal human capabilities. These stories preserve the concept that cloud effects could be detected through multiple sensory channels, not just direct visual observation. These legendary voyages, whether historically accurate in their details or mythologized representations of real navigational achievements, demonstrate the extraordinary sophistication that Polynesian widely cloud navigation could achieve in the hands of master practitioners. They show how cloud reading skills could be pushed to remarkable limits, enabling voyages across distances that seem impossible even by modern standards. The oral preservation of these legendary journeys serves multiple purposes beyond simple entertainment. The stories encode practical navigational knowledge within memorable narrative frameworks, ensuring that important techniques and principles would be preserved even when the specific skills were not actively practiced. They also provide inspiration and models for aspiring navigators, showing what could be achieved through dedication, skill, deep understanding of natural patterns. As we continue our peaceful drift through the star-filled Pacific night, these legendary voyages remind us of the extraordinary human achievement represented by Polynesian navigation. In an age before instruments, before written records, before any of the technological aids we take for granted, skilled navigators used nothing more than their trained senses and deep understanding of natural patterns to achieve feats of navigation that still inspire wonder and respect. The clouds that guided these legendary voyagers continued to drift across the Pacific sky, carrying the same information, creating the same atmospheric signatures, waiting for eyes trained to read their subtle language. In their formations and movements, in their colors and patterns, the ancient wisdom of navigation lives on, a testament to human ingenuity and the patient observation of the natural world that surrounds us all, across the ancient world, wherever human beings ventured onto the open seas. They developed ingenious methods for finding their way across vast distances using the natural world as their guide. Yet when we compare the navigation systems developed by different maritime cultures, the sophisticated cloud reading techniques of Polynesian navigators stand apart as a unique achievement, representing perhaps the most advanced form of atmospheric navigation ever developed by any seafaring people. In the Mediterranean Sea, the cradle of Western maritime tradition, ancient Greek and Phoenician navigators developed sophisticated techniques for ocean navigation that served them well in their more confined waters. These skilled sailors learned to read wind patterns, to recognize the distinctive characteristics of different coastlines, and to use the stars for directional guidance during their voyages between known ports and established trading centers. The Mediterranean navigators became masters of coastal navigation, developing detailed knowledge of harbor approaches, seasonal wind patterns, and the distinctive landmarks that marked safe passages through familiar waters. They learned to read the color changes that indicated different water depths, to recognize the types of seabirds that suggested proximity to specific coasts, and to use the positions of stars for maintaining general direction during overnight passages. However, the Mediterranean's relatively small size and the presence of numerous islands and coastlines created a navigational environment fundamentally different from the vast Pacific Ocean. Mediterranean navigators rarely needed to venture far from sight of land, and when they did undertake longer voyages, they could rely on well-established routes between known destinations. This geographical reality meant that the extreme long-distance navigation techniques developed by Polynesian navigators were simply not necessary in the Mediterranean world. Most significantly, Mediterranean navigators did not develop systematic, cloud reading techniques comparable to those used in the Pacific. While they certainly observed weather patterns and used cloud formations to predict storms and wind changes, they did not need to read clouds as indicators of distant land masses. In the Mediterranean's island-rich environment, direct visual contact with coastlines provided more reliable navigation information than atmospheric observations in the Indian Ocean. Arab and Persian navigators developed navigation systems that incorporated some elements similar to Polynesian techniques, but with important differences that reflected the unique characteristics of their maritime environment. These skilled navigators, who connected the coasts of Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia in vast trading networks, developed sophisticated understanding of monsoon patterns and seasonal weather systems. Indian Ocean navigators became experts at reading wind patterns and ocean currents, timing their voyages to take advantage of predictable seasonal changes that could carry their vessels efficiently across vast distances. They developed detailed knowledge of the relationship between weather patterns and navigation, understanding how seasonal atmospheric changes affected both wind direction and the reliability of other navigational indicators. Some Indian Ocean navigation traditions included elements of atmospheric observation that paralleled certain Polynesian techniques. Arab navigators learned to recognize the distinctive cloud formations that indicated the approach to the East African coast. They developed techniques for using atmospheric haze and color changes to estimate distances to familiar landmarks. This shift from traditional canoes to European ships also changed the cultural context in which navigation skills had meaning. Traditional navigation was intimately connected to the construction and sailing of Polynesian voyaging canoes, to the social organization required for long voyages, and to the cultural practices that surrounded oceanic travel. When communities began using European vessels instead of traditional craft, they lost not just navigation techniques but the entire cultural framework that gave those techniques their meaning and context. The conversion to Christianity, swept across much of Polynesia in the 19th century, created additional pressures for abandoning traditional practices. Many missionary groups viewed traditional navigation, with its spiritual elements and connections to ancestral knowledge, as incompatible with Christian beliefs. The chants and rituals that preserved navigation knowledge were often discouraged or forbidden as pagan practices. This religious transformation was particularly devastating for navigation knowledge because so much traditional wisdom was preserved in sacred chants and spiritual practices. When communities converted to Christianity, they often abandoned not just the religious aspects of their traditional culture, but also the memory techniques and oral preservation methods that had maintained navigation knowledge across generations. The establishment of European-style schools throughout the Pacific created educational systems that emphasized written knowledge over oral tradition, individual learning over community-based instruction, and European subjects over indigenous skills. Children who might once have learned navigation by observing master practitioners and gradually absorbing traditional knowledge found themselves spending their time in classrooms, learning to read European texts and master European-style subjects. These educational changes were often well-intentioned, as colonial administrators and missionaries genuinely believed they were, providing island communities with skills that would help them succeed in a changing world. However, the emphasis on European-style learning came at the expense of traditional knowledge systems, creating generations of young people who were literate in European languages but ignorant of their own navigation heritage. The introduction of wage labor and cash economies also transformed the social conditions that had supported traditional navigation. In traditional Polynesian societies, master navigators were supported by their communities, which recognized that the years of training required for navigation expertise served essential collective needs. But in colonial cash economies, time spent learning traditional skills could not be easily converted into money, making traditional education seem economically impractical. World War II created additional disruptions to traditional navigation knowledge. The Pacific became a major theater of warfare. With military operations disrupting island communities and traditional ways of life, many islands were occupied by military forces. Traditional voyaging was restricted or prohibited, and young men who might have become navigators were recruited into military service or wage labor supporting the war effort. The post-war period brought rapid modernization to much of the Pacific, with improved transportation, communication, and economic opportunities that further reduced dependence on traditional skills. The introduction of radio communication, motorized vessels, and eventually satellite navigation made traditional techniques seem not just unnecessary, but quaint remnants of a bygone era. By the mid-20th century, the decline of traditional navigation had reached critical levels across much of Polynesia. On many islands, the last master navigators were elderly men with no apprentices to carry on their knowledge. The chants and oral traditions that preserve navigation wisdom were being forgotten as younger generations focused on modern skills and opportunities. The loss was not just of technical knowledge, but of entire ways of understanding and relating to the ocean environment. Traditional navigation represented a form of environmental literacy that connected human communities intimately to natural patterns and processes. When this knowledge disappeared, communities lost not just navigation techniques, but a sophisticated understanding of their marine environment that had developed over countless generations. Some islands experienced complete breaks in their navigation traditions, with the last knowledgeable practitioners dying without passing on their skills to qualified successors. The complex training systems that had once ensured continuity across generations collapsed, leaving communities with no direct connection to their navigation heritage. The decline was particularly pronounced in areas that experienced the most intensive European colonization and missionary activity. Islands that maintain more traditional lifestyles and social structures sometimes preserve navigation knowledge longer. But even in these communities, the pressures of modernization gradually eroded traditional practices. Yet even as traditional navigation declined across much of the Pacific, the knowledge never disappeared completely. Remote areas, among traditional communities, and in the memories of elderly practitioners, fragments of the ancient wisdom survived. These surviving elements would eventually become the seeds of revival movements that would attempt to reconstruct and revitalize traditional navigation techniques. The decline of traditional Polynesian navigation represents more than just the loss of a particular set of skills. It illustrates the vulnerability of oral knowledge systems to rapid cultural change, and it demonstrates how the disruption of traditional social structures can lead to the disappearance of sophisticated technologies that took centuries to develop. As we continue our peaceful journey across the star-filled Pacific, we can feel a sense of loss for the wisdom that faded from these waters, but also hope for its eventual return. For the clouds still drift across the same sky, still carry the same information, still wait for eyes trained to read their ancient language. The knowledge may have faded, but the natural systems that made it possible continue unchanged, ready to teach their secrets once again to those patient enough to learn their subtle ways. Like a gentle tide returning to familiar shores, the ancient wisdom of Polynesian navigation began to flow back into Pacific communities during the latter half of the 20th century, carried by individuals and organizations who recognized that something precious had been lost and was worth recovering. This revival movement represents one of the most remarkable examples of cultural restoration in modern history. The successful reconstruction of sophisticated traditional knowledge that had nearly vanished from living practice. The revival began quietly in the 1960s and 1970s, sparked by a growing awareness among Pacific Islanders that their ancestors had possessed navigation skills of extraordinary sophistication, and that these skills represented not just historical curiosities, but living knowledge that could still serve important purposes in contemporary island communities. The movement was driven by a combination of cultural pride, practical interest, and growing recognition that traditional knowledge systems had value that had been underappreciated during the colonial period. One of the pivotal figures in this revival was Nainoa Thompson, young Hawaiian who became fascinated by stories of his ancestors, voyaging achievements, and determined to learn. traditional navigation techniques, even though no living practitioners remained in Hawaii to teach him. Thompson's quest led him to seek out the few surviving traditional navigators still practicing in other parts of the Pacific, beginning a learning journey that would help spark a renaissance of traditional navigation across Polynesia. Thompson's search brought him to the Caroline Islands in Micronesia, where he found Mo Pialig, one of the last traditional navigators still actively practicing the ancient arts. Pialig, a master navigator from the island of Satawal, possessed knowledge that stretched back through generations of traditional instruction, including sophisticated techniques for reading stars, waves, and atmospheric conditions that had been preserved in his community even as they disappeared elsewhere. The relationship between Thompson and Pialig represents a remarkable example of cultural knowledge transmission across vast distances and cultural boundaries. Pialig, recognizing the importance of preserving navigation knowledge for future generations, agreed to share his carefully guarded secrets with Thompson, beginning an intensive apprenticeship that would last for years and eventually enable Thompson to become one of the first modern practitioners of traditional Pacific navigation. This knowledge transfer was formalized through the Polynesian Voyaging Society. It was founded in Hawaii in 1973 with the ambitious goal of reconstructing traditional voyaging capabilities and using them to connect Pacific Island communities with their maritime heritage. The Society's first major project was the construction of Halia, a double-hulled voyaging canoe built using traditional techniques and materials, but designed for safety and educational purposes in the modern era. Leah's maiden voyage in 1976 from Hawaii to Tahiti marked a watershed moment in the revival of traditional navigation. The journey was completed entirely using traditional techniques, with Thompson and other crew members navigating by stars, waves, wind patterns, and atmospheric observations, including cloud reading methods that had been nearly forgotten for generations. The successful completion of this voyage proved that traditional navigation techniques were not just historical curiosities, but practical skills that could achieve remarkable precision even by modern standards. The impact of Leah's voyage extended far beyond the Hawaiian Islands. News of the successful traditional navigation voyage inspired Pacific Island communities throughout the region to reconsider their own navigation heritage and to begin efforts to recover traditional knowledge that had been lost or nearly forgotten. In their own communities in New Zealand, the revival movement inspired the construction of traditional waka voyaging canoes and the development of programs to teach traditional navigation techniques to Makri youth. These efforts connected with broader movements from Maori cultural revival, helping to restore not just navigation knowledge, but the cultural context that gave that knowledge meaning and significance. Similar revival efforts began in Tahiti, where the construction of traditional voyaging canoes and the training of new navigators helped reconnect Polynesian communities with their oceanic heritage. The success of these projects demonstrated that traditional knowledge could be recovered and adapted for contemporary purposes while maintaining its essential character and effectiveness. The revival movement also benefited from growing academic interest in traditional knowledge systems. Anthropologists, oceanographers, and other researchers began working with traditional navigators to document and understand navigation techniques, contributing to efforts to preserve and transmit this knowledge to new generations. Support helped legitimize traditional navigation as a sophisticated technical achievement worthy of serious study, and preservation. Modern technology played an interesting role in the revival process. While GPS and other modern navigation aids were sometimes used as backup systems during training voyages, the revival movement generally emphasized the importance of mastering traditional techniques without relying on modern instruments. However, modern communication and documentation technologies helped spread knowledge about traditional navigation and facilitate collaboration between revival efforts in different island communities. The educational aspects of the revival movement proved particularly important for its long-term success. Programs were developed to teach traditional navigation techniques in schools and community organizations, connecting young people with navigation knowledge and helping ensure that recovered skills would be transmitted to new generations. These educational efforts often emphasize not just the technical aspects of navigation, but the cultural values and environmental awareness that traditional navigation represented. One of the most remarkable aspects of the revival has been the reconstruction of cloud navigation techniques. Working with surviving traditional knowledge and careful observation of atmospheric patterns, modern practitioners have been able to redevelop sophisticated skills for reading cloud formations as navigation aids. This represents a particularly challenging aspect of traditional knowledge recovery, as cloud reading requires subtle observational skills that can only be developed through extensive practice and instruction. The revival movement has also emphasized the importance of understanding traditional navigation as an integrated system rather than a collection of separate techniques. Modern practitioners have learned to read combinations of natural signs, stars, waves, winds, clouds, and wildlife behavior as unified information sources, recreating the holistic approach that characterized traditional navigation at its most sophisticated. International voyaging projects have become important vehicles for demonstrating and developing traditional navigation skills. Multi-island voyages using traditional techniques have helped connect Pacific Island communities with each other and with their shared maritime heritage, while also providing practical training opportunities for new navigators learning traditional skills. The revival has also inspired innovations that adapt traditional techniques for contemporary purposes. Modern traditional navigators have developed methods for teaching ancient skills using contemporary educational approaches, creating training programs that can transmit complex traditional knowledge more efficiently than historical apprenticeship systems while maintaining the essential character of the traditional techniques. Climate change and environmental awareness have added new relevance to traditional navigation revival efforts. As Pacific Island communities face challenges from rising sea levels and changing weather patterns, traditional knowledge about ocean and atmospheric systems has gained new importance as a source of environmental understanding that can complement modern scientific approaches. The success of the revival movement has also had broader cultural impacts, contributing to growing pride in Pacific Island heritage and traditional knowledge systems. The demonstration that traditional navigation techniques could achieve remarkable precision has helped challenge stereotypes about indigenous knowledge and has contributed to broader recognition of the sophistication of traditional Pacific cultures. Perhaps most importantly, the revival has ensured that traditional navigation knowledge will not be lost to future generations. New practitioners trained in traditional techniques are now teaching others, creating chains of knowledge transmission that can continue into the future. Navigation schools and training programs have been established in multiple Pacific Island communities, ensuring that the ancient skills will remain available to those who choose to learn them. The revival movement has also demonstrated that traditional knowledge can be successfully recovered even after significant interruptions in transmission. The reconstruction of sophisticated navigation techniques from fragmentary surviving knowledge shows that cultural knowledge systems can be remarkably resilient when communities are committed to their preservation and revival. As we continue our peaceful drift through the Pacific night, we can feel a sense of hope and renewal in the knowledge that the ancient wisdom of cloud navigation has found new life in the modern era. The same clouds that guided voyagers centuries ago continue to carry their information across the Pacific sky. And once again, there are eyes trained to read their subtle language, hands skilled to guide vessels using their gentle guidance. The revival of traditional navigation represents more than just the recovery of historical techniques. It represents the restoration of a way of understanding and relating to the natural world that offers valuable perspectives for contemporary challenges. In learning to read clouds and stars, waves and winds, modern practitioners are also learning to see the ocean environment with the sensitivity and respect that characterize traditional Pacific cultures at their best. As our long journey through the world of Polynesian cloud navigation draws to its gentle conclusion, we find ourselves once again floating peacefully on the vast Pacific Ocean in the deep hours before dawn. The stars above us continue their ancient dance across the sky, the same constellations that guided countless voyagers across these waters through generations of exploration, discovery, and quiet homecoming. The waves beneath us maintain their eternal rhythm, carrying stories and memories across distances that seem to dissolve the boundaries between past and present. Between the ancient wisdom of navigation and the peaceful rest that awaits us all, the clouds that have been our companions throughout this journey continue to drift slowly across the star-filled sky. Their forms shifting and changing in the gentle trade winds that have blown across these waters for millions of years. In their movements, we can still read the subtle language that once guided voyaging canoes across impossible distances. The atmospheric vocabulary that spoke of distant islands and safe harbors to those patient. Enough to learn its delicate syntax. But now, as the night deepens and our minds grow quiet, these same clouds begin to blur and soften, their precise formations dissolving into gentle shapes that invite rest rather than navigation, sleep rather than alertness. The sharp observations required for reading their messages give way to a softer awareness, a peaceful appreciation for their beauty. As they paint ever-changing patterns against the infinite canvas of the Pacific sky, the wind that once carried crucial information about distant weather systems and approaching land masses now serves a gentler purpose, whispering lullabies across the water's surface, creating the soft sounds of waves and air that have soothed travelers on these waters. Since time immemorial, each gentle breath of air carries away the complexities of navigation, careful attention required for reading natural signs, replacing them with the simple pleasure of floating peacefully under the stars. The knowledge we have explored together, the sophisticated understanding of how islands create their own weather patterns, how coral lagoons paint their colors across the sky, how the interaction between land and atmosphere creates readable signs. For those who know how to interpret them, this wisdom remains with us, but in a transformed state, no longer demanding active attention, but settling into the deeper layers of understanding where learning becomes part of our very being. Think 4. A moment about the remarkable journey we have taken together through the world of cloud navigation. We have learned how ancient Polynesian navigators developed skills that seem almost supernatural in their precision and subtlety. Reading in the sky above them, detailed information about lands that lay beyond the horizon, beyond the reach of any sense except the patient observation of atmospheric patterns. We have discovered how the Pacific Ocean itself becomes a different place when viewed through the eyes of traditional navigation. Not an empty barrier between destinations, but a living system of interconnected signs and signals, where every cloud formation, every shift in wind direction, every change in the behavior of seabirds adds to a vast library of information that guides skilled readers. Safely across vast distances, the double-hulled voyaging canoes that carried these navigators have become in our imagination platforms for observation and understanding, floating laboratories where the careful study of natural patterns could be transformed into practical knowledge for finding specific islands among the thousands scattered across the Pacific's vast expanse. On these vessels, the reading of clouds became not just a navigation technique, but a form of meditation. A way of connecting deeply with the natural world and its subtle rhythms as sleep begins to claim us. The technical details of cloud formation and atmospheric reflections start to fade, leaving behind a deeper appreciation for the extraordinary sensitivity to natural patterns that traditional navigators developed. Their ability to distinguish between the cloud signatures of different types of islands, to read in subtle color variations the stories of distant lagoons and coral reefs, represents a level of environmental awareness that transforms our understanding of what it means to be truly at home in the natural world. The legendary voyages we have explored together, the great journeys of discovery that connected scattered island communities across thousands of miles of ocean, begin to blend into dreamlike narratives where the boundaries between history and myth dissolve into stories that speak to something deeper than mere factual knowledge. These tales of navigation, guided by nothing more than the patient reading of clouds and stars, remind us of capabilities that lie dormant in human consciousness, waiting to be awakened by the right combination of need, training, and connection. With the natural world, the comparison with other navigation traditions from around the world has shown us how unique and sophisticated Polynesian techniques were. But as we settle into rest, these comparisons fade in importance beside the simple, Wonder of human beings learning to read the subtle language of the natural world with such precision and reliability. The achievement stands on its own merits, a testament to what becomes possible when human intelligence is applied patiently and systematically to understanding natural patterns. Even the sad story of traditional navigation's decline in the face of modernization and cultural disruption transforms in our peaceful state from a tale of loss into part of a larger cycle of forgetting and remembering that characterizes all human knowledge. The wisdom was not truly lost, but only sleeping, waiting for the right moment to return. Like a seed that lies dormant through winter, but springs to life when conditions become favorable for growth. The modern revival of traditional navigation techniques becomes in our drowsy awareness a symbol of hope, a reminder that human wisdom once developed never truly disappears but can always be recovered by those willing to invest the patience and attention required for learning from the natural world. The success of contemporary traditional navigators in reconstructing sophisticated cloud reading skills shows that the capacity for this kind of environmental awareness remains available to us, waiting to be developed through practice and dedication. As our minds grow quieter and our awareness softer, the specific techniques of cloud navigation begin to merge into a general sense of being connected to the vast systems of earth and sky and sea that surround us all. The careful observation of atmospheric patterns becomes a gentle awareness of the beauty and complexity of the natural world. A peaceful appreciation for the endless interactions between land and water and air that create the ever-changing tapestry of weather and climate, the social and cultural dimensions of traditional navigation, the sophisticated educational systems that preserved complex knowledge across generations, the relationships between masters and students that transmitted not just technical information, but wisdom and understanding. These human elements of the traditions settle into our consciousness as reminders of how learning happens best when it connects technical knowledge with personal relationship and cultural meaning. The integration of different natural signs that characterize traditional navigation at its most sophisticated transforms in our peaceful state into a gentle awareness of how all things in the natural world are connected. How the behavior of birds relates to wind patterns. How wind patterns influence cloud formation. How cloud formation reflects the presence of distant land masses. How all these elements work together in vast systems of relationship and mutual influence. The ocean beneath us continues its eternal breathing, rise and fall of swells that have traveled thousands of miles without interruption, carrying within their rhythm the heartbeat of the planet itself. These waves that once provided crucial navigation information to skilled readers now serve simply as a gentle rocking motion that encourages rest, a natural cradle that has soothed travelers on these waters for countless generations. The clouds above us continue their slow drift across the star-filled sky, but their formations no longer demand interpretation or analysis. Instead, they become shapes of pure beauty, ephemeral sculptures of water vapor and light that appear and dissolve in endless variation. Each one unique and temporary, like thoughts or dreams that arise and pass away in the quiet mind, as sleep finally begins to claim us completely. The vast Pacific Ocean reveals its deepest secret, that it is not really vast at all, but intimate and peaceful. A place where the careful observation of natural patterns can transform into simple presence. Where the need to navigate gives way to the joy of simply being, floating peacefully under the stars in the gentle embrace of wind and wave and endless sky. The ancient wisdom of cloud navigation settles into our dreams like a blessing, a reminder that human beings are capable of extraordinary sensitivity to the natural world when they approach it with patience, respect, and the willingness to learn its subtle languages. In our sleep, we carry with us the knowledge that the skills of traditional navigators represent not just historical achievements, but permanent possibilities. Ways of relating to the world that remain available to any of us willing to invest the time and attention required for developing genuine environmental awareness. And so we drift peacefully towards sleep, carried by the same trade winds that filled the sails of ancient voyaging canoes, surrounded by the same stars that guided countless navigators safely across vast distances. floating on the same ocean that continues to carry within its depths. And in the sky above it all, the information needed to connect any point on its surface with any other. For those patient enough to learn the reading of its gentle, eternal signs, the clouds drift slowly across the star-filled sky, carrying their ancient messages toward horizons that disappear in the soft darkness before dawn. And we follow them peacefully into the quiet rest that waits beyond the edge of wakefulness, beyond the need for navigation, in the place where all journeys end and all wisdom finds its peaceful home in the dreaming mind. In the gentle stillness that follows our journey through the world of Polynesian cloud navigation, we find ourselves changed by the knowledge we have absorbed, enriched by the wisdom of ancient navigators who transformed the vast Pacific Ocean from an empty wilderness into a readable landscape of signs and signals. The techniques we have explored together represent more than mere historical curiosities. They embody a way of understanding and relating to the natural world that offers profound insights for our modern lives. The clouds continue their eternal dance across the Pacific sky, carrying the same information they have carried for millennia, waiting with infinite patience for eyes trained to read their subtle language. In their formations and movements, their colors and textures, they preserve the ancient wisdom of navigation, a testament to human ingenuity and the deep connection between careful observation and practical knowledge that characterized traditional Polynesian culture at its finest. The revival of traditional navigation in the modern era reminds us that wisdom, once developed through generations of patient practice and refinement, never truly disappears, but remains available to those willing to invest the time and attention required for its mastery. The success of contemporary navigators in reconstructing sophisticated cloud reading techniques demonstrates that the capacity for this kind of environmental sensitivity remains dormant in human consciousness, waiting to be awakened by the right combination of need, training, dedication to understanding natural patterns. As we reflect on the extraordinary achievements of Polynesian navigators, we are reminded of the profound difference between merely knowing about the natural world and truly understanding it through direct, sustained observation and practice. The cloud reading skills that enabled voyagers to find tiny islands across thousands of miles of open ocean were not learned from books or lectures, but developed through years of patient watching, careful attention to subtle variations in atmospheric patterns, and the gradual accumulation of observational wisdom that could only be gained through direct experience. This distinction between abstract knowledge and embodied understanding offers important lessons for our contemporary world, where we often mistake information for wisdom and technological capability for genuine skill. The Polynesian navigators achieved their remarkable precision not through superior technology, but through superior attention. The ability to perceive and interpret subtle natural patterns that remain invisible to those who have not developed the sensitivity required for reading them. The integration of cloud navigation with other observational techniques, star reading, wave pattern interpretation, wildlife behavior analysis, illustrates another important principle that extends far beyond navigation itself. The most sophisticated understanding comes not from mastering isolated techniques, but from developing the ability to perceive the relationships and interactions that connect different elements of complex systems into coherent wholes. Traditional Polynesian navigation represents one of humanity's greatest achievements in systems thinking, demonstrating how human intelligence, applied patiently and systematically over many generations, can develop extraordinarily sophisticated methods for understanding and working with complex natural phenomena. The navigators who could read the meaning of cloud formations in relation to bird behavior, wind patterns, and ocean swells had developed a form of environmental literacy that enabled them to function as integral parts of the marine ecosystem, rather than as external observers trying to impose control upon it. This ecological approach to navigation, understanding oneself as part of the natural systems being observed rather than separate from them, offers valuable perspectives for addressing contemporary environmental challenges. The traditional navigator's success came from learning to work with natural patterns rather than against them, finding their way by understanding and harmonizing with the rhythms and processes of the ocean environment rather than trying to dominate or control them. The oral traditions that preserved and transmitted traditional navigation knowledge across generations without writing represent another remarkable achievement that deserves recognition and study. The sophisticated memory techniques, the integration of practical information with cultural and spiritual contexts, the use of chant and story to encode complex technical knowledge. These educational innovations created one of the most effective knowledge preservation systems ever developed by human societies. The decline and revival of traditional navigation also offers important insights into the dynamics of cultural change and knowledge preservation in rapidly changing societies. The near loss of navigation skills during the colonial period illustrates how quickly sophisticated traditional knowledge can disappear when the social and cultural conditions that support it are disrupted. But the successful revival of these same skills demonstrates that traditional knowledge systems can be remarkably resilient when communities are committed to their preservation and renewal. The modern practitioners who have successfully reconstructed traditional navigation techniques have also shown how ancient wisdom can be adapted and integrated with contemporary needs and opportunities without losing its essential character. The educational programs, voyaging projects, cultural revival movements that have grown up around traditional navigation demonstrate that historical knowledge can find new relevance and application in contemporary contexts while maintaining its integrity and effectiveness. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Polynesian cloud navigation reminds us of the extraordinary human capacity for developing intimate, practical relationships with the natural world through patient observation and practice. The skills of the traditional navigators were not supernatural gifts available only to a chosen few, but developed capabilities that represent permanent human possibilities, ways of perceiving and understanding natural patterns that remain available to anyone willing to invest the time and attention required for their development. The clouds that drift across the Pacific sky as we conclude our journey together carry within their movements and formations the same information that guided ancient voyagers to new lands and safe harbors. The natural systems that made traditional navigation possible continue to operate with the same reliability and precision that characterized them centuries ago. The capacity for developing the sensitivity and understanding required to read these natural signs remains present in human consciousness, waiting to be awakened and developed. As we return from our imaginative voyage through the world of traditional navigation, we carry with us not just knowledge about historical techniques, but a renewed appreciation for the possibilities that open up when human beings approach the natural world with the patience, respect, and sustained attention that characterize genuine understanding. The wisdom of the cloud navigators continues to be available to us, not as historical curiosity, but as living knowledge that can enrich our contemporary relationship with the natural world that surrounds and sustains us all. In the end, the story of how Polynesian navigators learned to read clouds to find islands becomes a metaphor for all learning that involves developing sensitivity to subtle patterns and relationships in complex systems. Whether we are learning to understand atmospheric conditions, human relationships, artistic expressions, or any other domain that requires sensitivity to nuance and pattern, the principles exemplified by traditional navigation remain relevant and instructive. The patience required for developing observational skills, the integration of different types of information into coherent understanding, the importance of practical experience in developing genuine competence, the value of preserving and transmitting hard-won wisdom across generations. These elements of the navigation tradition offer guidance for learning and development in many areas of life beyond navigation itself, as the clouds continue their eternal journey across the Pacific sky, carrying their ancient messages toward distant horizons. We are reminded that the natural world continues to offer its teachings to those willing to listen, to observe, to learn its subtle languages through sustained attention and practice. The wisdom of the navigators lives on in the clouds themselves, in the endless dance of wind and water and light that creates the ever-changing patterns. They learn to read with such remarkable precision and reliability The gentle waves that rock us toward peaceful sleep carry within their rhythm the heartbeat of the ocean itself, the same pulse that guided ancient voyagers safely across vast distances toward their island homes. In their endless repetition, we find the peace that comes from connecting with natural rhythms larger than ourselves. The rest that follows from understanding our place within systems of relationship and interdependence that connect all things in the vast web of existence. And so we conclude our journey through the world of Polynesian cloud navigation with hearts full of wonder at human capability and minds enriched by wisdom that spans centuries and cultures, carrying within our dreams the knowledge that the skills of reading natural patterns with sensitivity and precision remain available to us, waiting to be developed through the patient practice of attention and the cultivation of respect for the subtle teachings of the natural world.